She walked into that ballroom wearing a borrowed dress and a smile that was held together by nothing but pride. She didn't come for the champagne. She didn't come for the dancing. She came because the man who once told her she'd never be enough was going to be there. And she refused to let him see her fall apart. But what happened next was something no one saw coming. One desperate favor, one stranger, one dance that should have meant nothing. And a billionaire who hadn't felt anything in 3 years suddenly couldn't look away. Drop a comment with your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, and let's begin. The invitation had been sitting on Emily Carter's kitchen counter for 11 days. She'd picked it up 3 times, carried it to the trash can twice, and pulled it back out both times because she couldn't figure out which felt worse, going or knowing she was too afraid to go. The 14th Annual Hargrove Foundation Gala. Black tie. Chicago Civic Ballroom. Saturday, November 9th. It wasn't her world. It had never been her world. Emily worked the morning shift at Cafe Vero on Michigan Avenue, the kind of coffee shop where men in $1,000 suits barely made eye contact when she handed them their drinks. And she picked up weekend hours waiting tables at a private dining club on the north side called Holbrook's, where she wore a stiff white apron and smiled until her face hurt, and went home smelling like garlic butter and disappointment. She made $22 an hour at Holbrook's, plus tips on a good night. The dress code for the Hargrove Gala cost more than her monthly rent. But Daniel would be there. Daniel Marsh, her ex of 2 years, the man who'd ended things 7 months ago via a text message that read, "I don't think we want the same things," which was the polite way of saying he'd started dating Veronica Holst, whose family owned 4 properties in Lincoln Park, and whose idea of a tight month was only buying 1 pair of shoes. Emily had found out through Instagram the way people found out about most devastating things these days. A photo of Daniel and a tall, glossy-haired woman at a rooftop bar, captioned, "Can't stop smiling," with a stupid little sun emoji. She'd stared at that photo for 40 minutes before putting her phone face down on the bathroom floor and sitting in the shower until the water went cold. That was 7 months ago. She was fine now. She was mostly fine. She called her best friend Jess at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night, which was always a sign that something was wrong. "He's going to be at the Hargrove Gala," Emily said, without even saying hello. There was a pause on Jess's end. "Daniel?" "Daniel and Veronica." Another pause. "How do you know?" "Her Instagram. They're going. There's already a pre-gala post. She's wearing Valentino." Emily sat down on her couch and pulled a throw blanket over her legs, even though it wasn't cold. "I got an invitation through the volunteer program at work. They donate proceeds to the Literacy Foundation every year, and they give staff members 2 comp tickets. Are you thinking about going?" "I think I have to go." "Emily, I know how it sounds. It sounds like you want to torture yourself at a fancy party. It sounds like I refuse to sit in my apartment on a Saturday night eating cereal while Daniel Marsh drinks free champagne with his rich girlfriend and thinks he made the right choice." Jess was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll lend you the black dress, the one from Carrie's wedding. It still fits you." Emily exhaled. "Thank you. But promise me something." "What?" "Don't do anything that makes you feel smaller than you already do. You hear me?" Emily looked around her apartment. The water stain on the ceiling she'd reported to the building manager 4 times. The stack of unpaid medical bills rubber-banded together on her bookshelf. The single lamp in the corner casting everything in yellow light because she'd never gotten around to buying a floor lamp, and overhead lighting was a headache. "I promise," she said. She wasn't sure she believed herself. The night of the gala, Emily stood in front of Jess's full-length mirror and tried to remember the last time she'd looked like someone who had her life together. The black dress was floor-length with a small slit at the left ankle and a structured back that required you to stand up straight, which was maybe why Jess had picked it, because it forced a kind of dignity even when you felt anything but. Emily had borrowed a pair of heels too, pointed-toe black ones that were half a size too small, and she'd done her own makeup in Jess's bathroom with a mascara wand and a red lipstick that was probably too bold but felt necessary. "You look beautiful," Jess said from the doorway. "I look like I'm about to do something I'll regret." "Those aren't mutually exclusive." Emily laughed, which helped. The Civic Ballroom was 20 minutes away by cab, and Emily spent the entire ride rehearsing expressions, calm, unbothered. "Oh, Daniel?" I barely thought about him. She practiced keeping her shoulders relaxed. She practiced looking like someone who drank champagne all the time and thought nothing of it. She was terrible at lying to herself, but she was going to try. The gala was enormous. Not just big, enormous, the way old money always was. Not flashy, but suffocating. The Civic Ballroom had been built in 1927, and every inch of it had that gilded, heavy-curtained grandeur that made you feel like you'd shrunk when you walked in. Crystal chandeliers hung in rows above a marble floor that reflected everything back at you, so that the crowd below looked like it was floating over itself. A 12-piece orchestra was playing something classical and slightly too loud from the raised platform at the far end of the room. The smell of flowers was overwhelming, lilies everywhere, white and perfect, like someone had decided this party would look like a funeral with better lighting. Emily handed her ticket to the door attendant and accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray, and spent the first 20 minutes pressed against the wall near the appetizer station, trying to look like she was simply taking a thoughtful moment rather than drowning. The people around her were the kind of wealthy that didn't feel the need to announce itself. No logos, no loud colors, just very good fabric and very confident posture and the way rich people talk to each other. Not loud, never loud, but with the complete certainty that the conversation they were having was the most interesting one in the room. Emily watched a woman in an emerald gown laugh at something her companion said, and wondered if she actually found it funny, or if this was simply what you learned to do when you'd been doing this long enough. She was on her second champagne when she saw him, Daniel. He was across the ballroom near the bar, wearing a tux that actually fit him. He'd always had a good tailor. That was one thing about Daniel. He understood clothes. And he was standing close to a woman Emily recognized immediately from Instagram. Veronica Holst was tall, ash blonde, with the kind of bone structure that read effortlessly on camera and devastatingly in person. She wore a burgundy gown and a pearl necklace that was probably real, and she was touching Daniel's arm when she laughed. This casual, claiming touch, the kind that said, "This one's mine," without any words. Emily looked away fast. Her chest did something complicated that she refused to call heartbreak because she'd already been through heartbreak. She was done with it. This was something else. This was anger, maybe, or something worse than anger, which was the specific misery of watching someone not miss you. She set her champagne glass down on a table she didn't belong to and decided she needed air. But the exit was on the other side of the room, which meant crossing the ballroom, which meant passing within 30 feet of Daniel, and she was calculating the geometry of how to avoid this when she heard his voice right behind her. "Emily." She went still. She turned around slowly because she needed the extra second to put her face together. Daniel looked good. She hated that. He had that easy, well-slept quality that people got when they weren't anxious about money. And he was holding a drink in a way that suggested he'd been holding drinks at events like this for years. Veronica was not with him. She'd stayed at the bar, and Emily caught the woman watching them from across the room with the polished, pleasant expression of someone who wasn't worried. "I didn't know you were coming tonight," Daniel said. "I could say the same. I thought you weren't really into these things. People change." He looked her over. Not unkindly, which was almost worse, because unkind would have been easier to dismiss. He looked at her the way you looked at someone you used to know when you were trying to figure out how much you still recognized. "You look good," he said. "Thank you. How are you? Are you still at the coffee place?" And there it was. She'd been waiting for it, and she'd known it was coming, and it still landed like a small, precise humiliation. The framing of her job as the coffee place, the diminishing of it, the assumption that nothing had changed for her while everything had changed for him. "I'm doing really well, actually," she said. "Yeah?" He took a sip of his drink. "I heard you were still at the same apartment. I ran into Marco." He mentioned it. Marco was her upstairs neighbor. She made a mental note to be annoyed at Marco later. "I like my apartment," she said, which was true, but it wasn't the point. "No judgment," Daniel said, in the tone people used specifically when they were judging. "It's just, you always talked about getting out of that neighborhood, and I thought maybe by now—" "What did you think?" Emily interrupted. Her voice stayed level. She was proud of that. Daniel blinked. "I just thought you'd have moved forward a little, you know?" Moved forward, like she was a piece on a board he'd left behind. "I am moving forward," she said. Excuse me. She turned away. Her heels felt like stilts. Her face felt hot. She was not going to cry at the Hargrove Foundation gala in a borrowed dress in front of Daniel Marsh and his rich girlfriend, and that was a decision she was making with absolute certainty even as her throat tightened. She turned sharply away from the ballroom entrance, moving without direction, and nearly collided with a passing waiter carrying a tray of crab cakes. Sorry, she muttered. She steadied herself and looked up and found she'd ended up near the edge of the dance floor, where the orchestra was playing something slow and couples were drifting in slow circles, and where a man was standing alone at the edge of the floor, not dancing, not talking to anyone, just standing. She noticed him because he was still, in a room full of people performing their wealth, laughing on cue, gesturing with their glasses, networking with the practiced enthusiasm of people who charged by the hour. This man was just standing, arms loose at his sides, drink in one hand, watching the room with an expression that wasn't bored exactly, more like absent. Like the most interesting thing he could think about wasn't in this room. He was tall, dark suit, not a tux, which meant either he didn't care about the dress code or he was important enough that no one would say anything. Dark hair, slightly longer than was typical for the finance and law crowd that dominated events like this. A jaw that looked like it had made some decisions. He wasn't movie star handsome in any conventional sense. There was something a little uneven about his features, a scar above his left eyebrow she could see even from here. But he had the kind of presence that made her look twice. Emily was across the floor from him when Daniel appeared at her side again. She didn't hear his approach. She just felt him there, that familiar shape in her peripheral vision, and when she turned, he was standing too close, and he had the specific expression of a man who'd thought of something else he wanted to say. Look, he said, his voice lower now. I'm not trying to be a jerk. I know, she said, because it was easier. I just worry about you, Em. You don't need to worry about me. You're working 2 jobs and you're alone and you came to this thing by yourself. Daniel! Her voice came out harder than she intended. Stop! I'm just saying, I know what you're saying. She looked at him. I'm fine. I'm doing fine. You don't have to feel sorry for me to feel good about where you are. He looked startled. She had maybe 5 seconds before the humiliation caught up to her pride, and she did something she couldn't take back. She turned and found herself facing the dance floor, and the man who was still standing alone at the edge of it, and she made a decision that was either the best or worst she'd ever made, and she walked toward him. Tut. He didn't look up until she was maybe 8 feet away. When he did, his eyes were dark, not black, more like a deep, complicated gray-brown, and they were direct in the way that some people's eyes were, that quality of actually looking at you rather than past you or around you. Emily stopped in front of him. Her heart was going faster than the situation warranted. She had no idea what she was doing. She was extremely aware of Daniel, still somewhere behind her, probably watching. Hi, she said. The man looked at her. I need... This is going to sound insane. You'd be surprised what doesn't sound insane to me at this point in the evening. She almost smiled. I need someone to dance with me. He didn't say anything immediately, which she read as confusion, so she went on. My ex is standing about 30 feet behind me, she said, and he just spent 5 minutes explaining to me why he feels sorry for me, and I need him to believe that I'm okay. I just need one dance. I know it's a lot to ask a stranger. The man looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't read the expression. He had that quality of being hard to read. Not cold exactly, but contained like someone who'd learned to keep things internal. What's his name? The man asked. She blinked. What? Your ex. What's his name? Daniel. Why? So I know who I'm performing for. And then, slightly, not a full smile, but something that suggested a smile was possible, the corner of his mouth moved. I'm Ethan, he said. Emily. He set his drink down on the nearest surface without looking for it, which was the move of someone who knew where things were without checking, and he extended his hand. One dance, he said. She didn't know what she expected. She thought it would feel awkward, 2 strangers going through the motions of a slow dance for the benefit of an audience. She thought she'd be counting in her head, monitoring Daniel's position in her peripheral vision, waiting for it to be over so she could breathe normally. She didn't expect the way he moved. Ethan Calloway, she didn't know his last name yet, just Ethan, just this stranger, danced like someone who'd been doing it a long time. Not showy, not performing. He led with quiet certainty, his hand at her back steadying without pressing, and he had that rare quality in a dance partner of making you feel like you were the one doing it right. She relaxed, which surprised her. The orchestra was playing something she didn't know, something with a long, low pull to it, a melody that circled back on itself. And the chandeliers above turned everything gold, and Emily let herself be led and tried to remember why she'd come here tonight. She could feel Daniel somewhere in the room. She didn't look. "Is he watching?" Ethan asked quietly, close enough that she could hear him without him raising his voice. "I think so," she said. "I'm trying not to check." "Don't check," he said. "Nothing reads worse than someone looking for the reaction." "Is that experience talking?" Unfortunately. She glanced up at him. Up close, he looked different than he had from across the room. Less like a photograph, more like a person. There were shadows under his eyes that suggested he either didn't sleep enough or slept badly, and the set of his mouth had a practiced quality, like he'd learned what expression to wear at functions like this, and he wore it, but it cost him something. "You don't want to be here," she said. It came out before she decided to say it. He looked down at her. "What makes you say that?" "You were standing alone for a while before I came over. You had that," she searched for the word, "that I'd rather be anywhere else thing." Something shifted in his expression. Not offended, more like surprised. "I was thinking about something," he said. "What?" A pause, then, "My daughter, she's 7. She had a bad dream last week, and she wouldn't sleep unless I left the light on in the hall. I've been leaving it on every night since, and she hasn't had another bad dream. But I keep thinking, what if she does? What if she's having one right now and the light doesn't help?" Emily looked at him. She hadn't expected that. "Does someone stay with her tonight?" she asked. "Her nanny. She's good. Claire's been with us 3 years. She knows what to do." He paused. "That doesn't stop you thinking about it." "No," Emily said. "I imagine it doesn't." They danced. The music moved around them. "What's her name?" Emily asked. "Sophie." And something in his voice when he said it, careful, a little tender, the way people said names that mattered, made her chest do something quiet and unexpected. "That's a good name," she said. "She picked it herself," he said. "I mean, we named her. But she's decided it's a good name and she's very firm about it." Emily laughed. A real one, not the practiced social kind. 7-year-olds are very firm about things. Are they always like that? I have no idea. I don't have kids, but I remember being 7, and yes, I was extremely firm about everything. What kinds of things? That my stuffed bear needed to face a specific direction when I slept. That grapes were fine, but raisins were a betrayal. That the school bus driver was probably actually a spy. Ethan looked at her, and this time the almost smile became an actual one. Brief, unguarded, changing his whole face for a second. "The raisin thing is correct," he said. "It's completely correct," she agreed. "They're just sad grapes. Why would anyone do that?" "I'll tell Sophie you said that. She feels the same way." They were both laughing now, quietly, and Emily realized she'd completely forgotten to monitor where Daniel was. And when the orchestra shifted into the next piece, a slower pull, a cello leading, Ethan didn't step back. Neither did she. She noticed Daniel approaching before Ethan did. He came from their left, moving through the couples on the edge of the dance floor with the body language of someone who'd made a decision that he wasn't entirely sure about. Veronica was still at the bar, watching with that pleasant, unworried expression. Emily's hand tightened slightly on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan noticed. He tracked it without turning his head, just a slight adjustment of his weight, like he'd recalibrated. Daniel stopped about 6 feet away at the edge of the dance floor and waited until Emily made eye contact. "Having fun," he said. Not hostile exactly. That performative casualness of someone who wanted to appear unbothered while very clearly being bothered. Emily opened her mouth, but Ethan spoke first. He turned, but unhurried, not aggressive, and he looked at Daniel with an expression that was completely flat. Not angry, not dismissive, just absolutely clear, the way very few people were actually able to be clear, with no ambiguity about what was underneath it. "She's dancing," Ethan said. "You're interrupting." It wasn't a long sentence. It wasn't theatrical. But there was something in the delivery, quiet, complete, the total absence of any need to prove anything, that made it land harder than a raised voice would have. Daniel blinked. Around them, a few nearby couples had slowed slightly. A woman in a gold dress glanced over. The man she was dancing with followed her gaze. "I was just—" Daniel started. "She doesn't need anything from you right now," Ethan said, in the same even tone. "Enjoy your evening." Then he turned back to Emily. Just like that. Like Daniel was an interruption that had been handled and was already over. Daniel stood there for another 2 seconds. Emily could see it on his face. The calculation, whether to push back, whether the social cost was worth it, and then he turned and walked away. Emily exhaled. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "No," Ethan agreed, "but you didn't have to help me not look like I was standing alone for an hour." She looked at him. "Was that true?" she asked. "About thinking about Sophie?" "Yes," he said simply. "You weren't just performing something to make me feel better?" He seemed to consider the question seriously. "No, I don't tend to perform things. I'm not very good at it." Emily thought about the way he'd spoken to Daniel, saw that flat, unhesitating certainty. And she believed him. "I almost didn't come tonight," she told him. "Why did you?" "Because not coming felt like letting him matter too much." Ethan nodded, slow. "That makes sense." "Does it? Because from the outside it probably looks like a disaster." "From the outside it looks like a woman who got dressed up and showed up," he said. "Which is more than most people manage to do when things are hard." Emily didn't have an answer for that. The orchestra played. The chandeliers overhead turned the room gold and too warm and full of all those people who seemed so certain of themselves. And Emily stopped feeling like she was performing and simply let herself be in the moment, this strange, unlikely moment that had started as a prop and become something else she didn't have a word for yet. The dance ended the way dances had to end, the orchestra resolving into silence before beginning again, and Emily and Ethan stepped apart with the slight, specific awkwardness of people who'd been close and were now not. "Thank you," Emily said. "Sure." "That was—" She stopped, tried again. "You didn't have to actually be nice. You just had to stand there." Ethan looked at her, and there was something in his expression she couldn't quite locate. Not warmth exactly, but the possibility of it, like a window that wasn't open but wasn't locked. "I wasn't performing," he said. "I told you." She believed him. That was the thing. She believed him completely, which was unusual because Emily Carter had spent a long time learning not to trust the things that felt too easy. This hadn't felt easy. It had felt complicated and surprising and real. "Can I get you a drink?" he asked. And she said yes. They found a corner of the gala that was quieter, a small alcove off the main ballroom, where the music became a low presence rather than a demand. And Ethan came back with 2 glasses of something that wasn't champagne, which she appreciated. "What is this?" she asked. "Scotch soda." "I find champagne at these things is more about optics than drinking." I was thinking the same thing. She took a sip. It was good. "How many of these galas do you go to?" "Too many," he said, without elaborating. She thought about asking what he did. It felt like the normal next question, the social script. And then she thought about the way he'd looked across the ballroom when she first noticed him, that alone in a crowd quality, and she decided there was something more interesting to know first. "Why'd you come tonight?" she asked. "If you don't want to be here." He was quiet for a second. "Obligation? To the foundation?" "Partially, and—" He paused. "It's been suggested to me by people who care about me that I should spend less time in my house and more time around other human beings." Suggested. Strongly suggested. "Do you disagree with them?" "I disagree with most things," he said, but it wasn't defensive. It was almost dry, like he found himself mildly exasperating too. "I think they're probably right. I just find it—" He stopped. "Hard?" she offered. He looked at her sideways. "Yeah, me too," she said. And for a moment, they just sat with that. Two people who were both finding it hard, at a party full of people making it look easy. Emily took another sip of her drink. The alcove they'd found was decorated with a framed print of the Chicago skyline. Old, the kind that showed the city's silhouette before half the current buildings existed, and a small table and two chairs that seemed like they'd been placed there for exactly this kind of conversation. "What do you do?" he asked. He'd waited long enough that it felt genuine rather than scripted. "I work at a coffee shop," she said, "and I wait tables on weekends at a private dining club on the north side." She watched his face for the flicker she'd learned to expect, the slight recalibration when people understood she was working class at a charity gala. But it didn't come. "I have a background in graphic design, but the market's been brutal for 3 years, and the shop work keeps the lights on." "What kind of design?" he asked. "Branding, mostly. Logos, visual identity for small businesses. I was with a small studio for 2 years before they folded." She said it flatly, because she'd learned flat was better. Sympathy made her feel worse than none at all. "It happens. I'm figuring out the next thing." Ethan nodded. "What's the next thing?" "I genuinely don't know. I have about 4 different plans and none of them are funded, and I rotate between feeling like one of them will work and feeling like I should pick the most stable option and stop pretending I'm going to do something I love." She looked at him. "Sorry, that was a lot." "No, it wasn't," he said simply. "You don't have to be polite." "I'm not being polite. I was listening." He turned the glass in his hands. An unconscious gesture, she thought, something he did when he was thinking. The thing about doing something you love is that it's a different kind of hard than doing something safe, and it's harder to explain to other people why you'd choose the first kind of hard. "Yes," she said, "exactly that. My father told me to go into law," he said. My family has a background in that. I went into manufacturing. He paused. "It was the right choice, but it was not a conversation that ended cleanly." "Did he come around?" Something moved across Ethan's face, complicated, briefly visible. "He died before the business became what it became." "I'm sorry," Emily said. He nodded. "He would have had opinions," he said, and it came out with a quality she couldn't quite read. Rueful, maybe, or just honest. She wanted to ask more. She found she wanted to ask a great number of things, which was unusual. She was a person who generally kept questions to herself until she was sure of the ground. "Sophie's mother," she started, then caught herself. "Sorry, I don't—" "You can ask," he said. "You don't have to answer. I know." He was quiet for a moment. "She died 4 years ago. Aneurysm, very fast. Sophie was 3. Emily's chest went tight. "Ethan, I'm so sorry." "Thank you." He said it the way people said it when they'd heard it 1,000 times and had made a kind of peace with it, not dismissively, but with a gentleness toward both himself and the person saying it. "Sophie doesn't really remember her. He stopped. "I used to think that was tragic, and now I think it might be more complicated than tragic. She has her own idea of her mother from photos and stories. She's building something. I don't know what to think about that." "That sounds hard to carry alone," Emily said quietly. Ethan looked at her. Not startled exactly, but there was something in his expression, like she'd said something that landed differently than the usual offerings. "Yes," he said. Just that. The alcove was quiet. The music from the ballroom was a warm, low murmur through the wall. "I haven't talked about this in a while," he said. "With someone who wasn't—" he seemed to search for the word. "Paid to listen." "Therapist?" "Among others." Emily almost laughed, not unkindly. "When's the last time you talked to someone just because?" "Yeah." He thought about it genuinely. "I'm not sure I can answer that precisely." "That's a sad answer." "It's an honest one." She looked at him, at this man who was not what she'd expected him to be, who was not performing anything, who had a daughter named Sophie, who didn't like raisins, and a scar above his eyebrow and dark circles under his eyes, and who was telling her the truth at a charity gala where everyone else seemed to be telling a version of themselves that was slightly too polished to believe. "You should probably go back to the party," she said. "People are probably looking for you." "Probably," he said. He didn't move. I should check if my invite included dinner seating. Emily. She stopped. He looked at her directly. No social function gloss, just that gray-brown directness. I'm glad you asked me to dance, he said. She didn't know what to say to that. It landed too simply to deflect and too sincerely to minimize. Me too, she said finally, and meant it. That was when they found him. She heard the voices first, footsteps, a specific urgency in tone, the cluster of sound that meant people moving with purpose. She turned and saw 3 men coming through the alcove entrance in rapid conversation, all of them in suits, all of them with the air of people who worked for someone rather than working for themselves. The one in front, 40s, dark tie, face doing something complicated between relief and anxiety, spotted Ethan and stopped short. Mr. Calloway? He was slightly breathless, like he'd been looking for a while. The Hartman group is asking for a word before the dinner seating, and Jenkins needs a decision on the Pacific contract before— I'll be there in a moment, Ethan said. His voice hadn't changed, still that same measured, quiet quality. But the men in suits had stopped completely, and the one in front nodded and stepped back, visibly rearranging himself. Emily sat very still. Mr. Calloway. The name was familiar in the way that things were familiar when you'd heard them in passing without paying full attention. In a headline you'd scrolled past, in background noise on television, in the casual shorthand of people who talked about business the way Emily talked about coffee orders. Calloway Automotive. She'd seen the name. Everyone had seen the name. The company had been everywhere for the past 3 years. Profiles in business magazines, aggressive expansion into European markets, a very public and very successful lawsuit against a competitor that had made the financial news for months. Ethan Calloway was the founder, the CEO. The man whose face was on the cover of Forbes 18 months ago, standing in front of a production floor in Detroit, looking at the camera like he'd already decided what was going to happen next. She'd seen that photo. She hadn't recognized him without the context. She looked at him now, at this man she'd been sitting with for 40 minutes, who told her about his daughter's nightlight and his dead father, and the way grief was more complicated than tragic. And she felt the floor beneath her shift in a very specific, very familiar way. The way floors shifted when you realized you'd been somewhere you had no business being. Ethan looked at her, and he must have seen something in her face because his expression changed. Not much, but enough. Emily, you're Ethan Calloway, she said. Her voice came out steady, which she was grateful for. You're the Ethan Calloway. Yes, he said simply. No apology, no performance of it. I didn't— She stopped. You let me talk about my 2 jobs. You asked about my daughter, he said. That felt more important. She stared at him. The men in suits were hovering near the entrance, not quite leaving. I need a minute, Ethan said to them, without looking away from her. Sir, the Hartman— A minute, he repeated, and there was nothing loud in it, but they went quiet immediately. Emily looked at her glass, then at the framed skyline print on the wall, then at him. I was complaining about my rent to one of the wealthiest men in the country, she said. You were talking, he said. There's a difference. There really isn't. Emily? He leaned forward slightly. I have not had a real conversation at one of these things in— He stopped. A long time. And I wasn't performing interest. I told you that. I know, she said. So what's the problem? She looked at him, and she wanted to say, the problem is that nothing about this is what it looked like 20 minutes ago, and I showed up tonight wearing borrowed shoes and trying to convince my ex I was fine, and you are a man whose company is in the news every other week, and whatever this was, whatever conversation this was, it can't be what it felt like. But what she said was, I should find my table. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he stood. I'll find you, he said. You have a Pacific contract to deal with. Emily. She looked at him. I'll find you, he said again. She didn't answer. She picked up her glass and walked out of the alcove into the brightness of the main ballroom, and she did not look back to check if he was watching, because she already knew he was. And she already knew that wasn't the problem. The problem was that she wanted him to be. She found her table. It was round, set for 10, draped in white linen with the centerpiece of those same overwhelming lilies, and it was populated with people Emily had never met and would probably never see again. A middle-aged couple from Evanston who ran a small philanthropic trust, two attorneys from the same firm who were careful not to be seen talking only to each other, and a woman named Barbara who introduced herself 3 times without seeming to realize it. Emily sat in the chair she'd been assigned and unfolded her napkin and smiled at all the right moments, and ate a piece of salmon that cost more than her electric bill, and spent the entire first course wondering if he was actually going to find her. She told herself it didn't matter. She reminded herself what she knew now. Ethan Callaway, the Ethan Callaway, a man whose net worth had been printed in magazines, whose company manufactured luxury vehicles for people who considered $100,000 a reasonable entry point for a car, whose name appeared in financial headlines the way weather appeared in conversation, constantly, casually, and as a given. He was not someone who wandered around charity galas talking to waitresses from the north side about raisins and childhood stuffed animals, except that he had. For 40 minutes, without performing it, without looking like he was doing anyone a favor. She pressed her water glass against her palm under the table and tried to feel normal. Barbara introduced herself again. "Emily," Emily said. "Nice to meet you." Across the ballroom, somewhere past the dance floor and the lilies and the 12-piece orchestra, Ethan Callaway was probably back where he belonged, surrounded by executives talking about Pacific contracts and investment groups and all the machinery of a life that had nothing to do with hers. That was fine. That was how it was supposed to be. She'd gotten what she came for. She'd danced. She'd survived the Daniel conversation. She'd made it through the evening without crying in a bathroom, which was a genuine success by the metrics she'd set coming in. She was fine. She was absolutely, completely fine. Then the seat to her left pulled out, and Ethan sat down in it, and she was not fine at all. He set his drink on the table and loosened his tie, just slightly, one small adjustment that suggested he'd made a decision about the evening, and this was part of it. And he looked at her with the same direct expression she was starting to understand was simply how his face worked when he wasn't performing anything. "You found your table," he said. "You found me," she said. "I told you I would." She looked at him. "You have a Hartman group waiting for you." "I talked to Hartman," he said. "Jenkins can handle the contract call from the car." "You're going to make your finance team deal with a major contract because Jenkins is the one who should have been on that call anyway," he said. "And I've been using him as an excuse to not be in rooms I don't want to be in, which isn't fair to him." He said it evenly, without drama, like this was a small personal accounting he was doing in real time. "He's been managing my avoidance for 2 years. He can handle one contract call." Emily looked at him for a moment. "That's either very self-aware or very irresponsible." "Probably both," he said. The couple from Evanston were watching this interaction with politely concealed interest. Emily became aware that Ethan Callaway sitting down at a random table at the Hargrove Gala was not a thing that went unnoticed in a room like this. She could feel the shift in the surrounding social temperature, the slight recalibration, the way eyes moved and conversations paused and then resumed at a slightly different angle. She didn't look around. She kept her eyes on him. "People are going to think this is something," she said quietly. "It is something," he said. "I don't know what yet, but it's not nothing." She didn't have an answer for that either. He had a way of saying direct things in a way that left no graceful exit, not because he was trapping her, but because he simply meant them and didn't see the point of dressing them up. The dinner service continued around them. What happened next was not what Emily expected, and she would think about it later, not the whole evening, but this specific part, as the moment when something shifted from possible to real. Because what Ethan did was not impress her. He was not charming in the way wealthy men at charity galas were charming, with the practiced warmth and the curated story and the subtle signals about access and status. He simply sat down and talked to her, and then he listened, and the listening was real. She told him about Cafe Vero, the regular at 7:15 every morning, who ordered the same thing and never said thank you, and how she'd started just setting his drink on the counter when she saw him coming through the door, and how one day he'd stopped and looked at the cup and looked at her and said, "You remembered," like she'd done something remarkable, and how she'd thought about that for weeks afterward. She told him about Holbrook's, about the couple who came in every Friday for their anniversary dinner and always ordered the same thing and always held hands across the table, and how she found them either unbearably sweet or unbearably sad depending on what kind of week she was having. She told him about the design work she missed, the way there was a specific satisfaction in building something visual from nothing, and taking the vague shape of an idea someone had in their head and translating it into something they could hold and show to people. She'd been good at it. She still thought she was good at it. She just hadn't had the money or the clients or the stability to rebuild that part of her life since the studio folded. Ethan listened to all of it, not with the performed attention of someone waiting for their turn to talk, but with the actual listening of someone for whom the information mattered. "The couple," he said when she'd finished talking about Holbrooks. "The anniversary couple. Do you think they're happy?" "I used to think obviously yes," she said. "Lately, I think maybe it doesn't have to be obvious from the outside. Maybe the holding hands is enough of an answer." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife and I used to argue about where we kept the spare keys," he said. "It was a very stupid argument. She thought they should go in the kitchen drawer, and I thought they should go on the hook by the door." He turned the glass in his hands again. "I kept the hook after she died. The keys are on it. It's been 4 years, and I've never moved them to the drawer." Emily felt the quiet weight of that settle in her chest. "I think that's the opposite of a stupid thing," she said. He looked at her. "Most people tell me I should redecorate, move on from the small habits." "Most people don't know what they're talking about," she said. That small, almost there smile again, more visible now, closer to real. The dinner service cleared the main course and brought dessert, and the woman named Barbara introduced herself to Ethan with tremendous enthusiasm, and he was polite and patient and answered her questions without being dismissive, which told Emily something she filed away. Around them, the gala continued its gilded rotation. Toasts, dancing, networking with champagne in hand, and the two of them sat in a small, unlikely pocket of honesty in the middle of it, and neither of them seemed in a hurry to leave. "Can I ask you something personal?" Emily said, when the dessert plates were mostly cleared. "You can ask," he said. Same answer as before. "Do you actually enjoy any of this? Not just tonight, but the whole thing. The business, the events, She gestured vaguely at the ballroom. "The level of it." He thought about that seriously, which she'd come to expect. "Parts of it," he said. "The manufacturing side, the actual engineering, the design of the vehicles, talking to the people on the production floor who've been doing it for 20 years and know things I'll never know. That part I love. That part I'd do for nothing." He paused. "The rest of it is," he searched for the word, "overhead. Necessary overhead? You pay it because the work requires it." "That's honest." "You asked an honest question. Most people in your position say they love all of it." "Most people in my position have learned which things to say," he said. Not bitterly, just as a fact. "You're not very good at that, are you?" she said. It came out like a statement, not a question. "Terrible," he agreed. "Ask anyone who's worked for me longer than 6 months." "Is that a problem?" He tilted his head slightly. "Depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to manage a public image, yes. If you're trying to build something real..." He paused. "I think people mostly know when they're being handled. I'd rather just say the thing." She looked at him for a moment. "You'd rather just say the thing," she repeated slowly. "Yes." "Then say one," she said. "Something you'd normally keep to yourself at an event like this." He looked at her. The noise of the ballroom was a warm, distant thing around them. "I don't want to go home to an empty floor, but," he said quietly, "Sophie's going to be asleep. Clara will be reading in the guest room with the door mostly closed. And I'm going to come in and check on Sophie, and she's going to be fine. She's always fine. And then I'm going to be the only one awake in a 5,000 square foot penthouse, and I don't know what to do with that particular silence anymore." Emily didn't say anything for a moment. The honesty of it was so unarmored that responding felt like it required care. "How long has it been like that?" she asked. 4 years, he said, more or less. "That's a long time to be the only one awake." "Yes," he said, "it is." She thought about her own apartment, the yellow lamp light, the water stain, the stack of bills, the specific silence of a space that was too small for loneliness to really echo, which meant you couldn't even get dramatic about it. Her loneliness was just there. Constant background noise. "Mine's different," she said. "But I understand the thing you mean, where the quiet starts to have a shape." "Yes," he said, And he said it like she'd confirmed something. They sat with that for a moment. Two people who'd each said more than they'd intended, at a charity gala full of people who hadn't said anything real all evening. Then Ethan looked at his watch, a reflex more than a decision, and something shifted in his expression. Not the end of the conversation, but a kind of reckoning with it. "Come see the city," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "The penthouse has a terrace. You can see the entire lakefront from it." He said it simply, like he was offering to show her a photograph. I'm not trying to." He stopped himself, which was the first time she'd seen him do that. "I'm not trying to take advantage of the situation. I want to be clear about that." "I know," she said. And she did know. That was the strange thing. In a room full of men who knew how to perform sincerity, she'd somehow ended up spending the evening with one who didn't know how to perform anything. "It's just the view," he said, "and probably a better drink than this." He looked at his glass. "And Sophie is asleep, so she won't interrogate you, which I understand is what she typically does with new people." Emily looked at him, at this man who was not what the magazine cover had suggested, who was complicated and careful in carrying a specific kind of loneliness, and who talked about his daughter the way people talked about the most important thing they had. She thought about the borrowed dress, the too small shoes, the 11 days that invitation had sat on her kitchen counter. She thought about what Jess had said. Don't do anything that makes you feel smaller than you already do. And she thought, for the first time all evening, that she wasn't feeling small. She felt, improbably, like herself. Not the version of herself she'd rehearsed on the cab ride over, the unbothered, moving forward version. The actual version, with the unpaid bills and the 2 jobs and the 4 half-formed plans for her future. That version. He'd asked questions about that version. He'd listened to the answers. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "Okay? I'll come see the city," she said. "Just the view." "Just the view," he agreed. And she stood up from the table, and Barbara said her name again as she left, and the orchestra was playing something that sounded almost hopeful, and Emily Carter walked out of the Hargrove Gala with a billionaire she'd met 45 minutes ago. And it was either the worst decision she'd made in months or the first honest one. She was genuinely not sure which. The November air hit them the moment the doors opened. Sharp and lake-scented. The kind of Chicago cold that wasn't subtle about what it was doing. Emily's borrowed dress had no real back to speak of, and she'd left her coat check ticket inside, and she made a sound that was halfway between a gasp and a laugh, and Ethan shrugged out of his jacket before she'd finished the sound and put it around her shoulders. It was warm. It smelled like something plain and clean, not a cologne she recognized. "Thank you," she said. "The car's here," he said, nodding toward the black vehicle that had appeared at the curb with the quiet efficiency of things that were arranged in advance without drama. She looked at the car, then at him. "Do you ever have to wait for anything?" she asked. He considered it. "Medical results," he said. "Traffic. Sophie's school plays, the good ones run long." She laughed at that, a real one, and it fogged briefly in the cold air, and she got in the car. The drive to his building took 12 minutes. She knew because she watched the city move past the window and counted herself through it. The lit-up architecture of Michigan Avenue, the shift into the quieter, denser luxury of the Gold Coast, the building materializing as a dark tower of glass against the November sky. She was telling herself a version of events in which this was an ordinary thing to do. 2 people who'd talked at a party continuing the conversation somewhere quieter. And it mostly worked because she was making an active effort not to count floors as the elevator rose. She counted 14 before she stopped counting. The penthouse was, she didn't have the word immediately. Vast was part of it, but vast suggested empty, and it wasn't empty. It was full of things that were clearly lived in. A child's drawing on the refrigerator, a stack of board games on the shelf that looked genuinely used rather than decorative, Sophie's rain boots by the front door in a size that made Emily's chest do something complicated. The view through the floor-to-ceiling windows was the thing she'd agreed to come for, and it was everything he'd said. The entire dark curve of Lake Michigan laid out below, the city's lights reflecting off it in long, broken columns. The kind of view that made you understand for a moment why some people paid whatever they paid to have it. But it was Sophie's rain boots she kept looking at. "Coffee?" Ethan asked from the kitchen. "Yes, please." She moved to the windows. The lake was enormous and very still from this height. This is, yeah, this is something. Most nights I don't see it anymore, he said from somewhere behind her. You stop looking at the things that are always there. That's a sad thing to say about a view like this. I know it is. The sound of a coffee machine, the quiet domestic percussion of two cups being pulled from a shelf. She watched the lake and thought about the specific thing he'd said at the gala about coming home to an empty floor, and she understood it better now. Not the size of it, she'd expected the size, but the way a space this large could simultaneously be full of evidence of love, the drawings, the boots, the board games, and still echo. He came to stand beside her with two mugs, and he handed her one, and they stood at the window. She drew that, he said, nodding toward the refrigerator where a crayon rendering of what appeared to be a very happy purple horse was held up with a magnet shaped like an Illinois license plate. She's going through a horse phase. Everything is horses. How long has the phase been going on? 7 months? Has she asked for a horse? 3 times in writing, once in what she described as a formal presentation with slides. He said it absolutely straight-faced. She used 3 sticky notes and a piece of cardboard. Emily turned to look at him. She made slides. She has very strong feelings about visual communication. Emily laughed, fully, genuinely, the laugh that came out when she wasn't monitoring anything. She sounds extraordinary. She's a lot, he said, and the warmth in it was the same warmth she'd heard before. That careful, enormous thing he carried when he talked about his daughter. She's the best person I know. She's also exhausting. She asked me 17 questions this morning before 7 o'clock. What kinds of questions? He thought about it. Whether fish sleep, whether the clouds are always the same clouds or new ones, whether I would still love her if she were a walrus. He paused. That last one required clarification. What did you tell her? I told her I would love her especially if she were a walrus, he said, because walruses have a very hard time and they need more love, not less. Emily looked at him, at this man standing in his enormous kitchen in his work clothes, holding a coffee mug and recounting questions from his 7-year-old with a kind of exhausted, bottomless love in his voice. She thought, this is the thing people don't put in the magazine profiles. They moved to the terrace eventually. He opened the heavy glass door and the cold came back with full force, but the view from out there was different, more immediate. The wind off the lake doing something dramatic with the city sounds below. She kept his jacket. He didn't ask for it back. They leaned against the terrace railing, far enough apart to be unambiguous, but close enough to hear each other without raising voices, and they talked. She told him about her family, her mother in Milwaukee, her younger brother who'd just started at a community college, and who she was quietly helping with rent without telling her mother because her mother would tell her she couldn't afford to and would be right. She told him that she'd moved to Chicago at 24 with $400 and a graphic design portfolio and a fierce, slightly delusional certainty that she was going to make something happen, and that she still had the certainty, but the delusional part was harder to hold on to at 30. He told her about the business, not the way it appeared in press coverage, but the way it felt, the actual texture of it, the engineers he'd grown up working alongside who were still with him 20 years later, the weight of signing a paycheck for 12,000 employees, the specific anxiety of a downturn when you knew the faces behind the numbers. He talked about it the way she talked about design, with the vocabulary of someone who genuinely understood the material from the inside. You love it, she said. The core of it, he said. Yes. But you're tired. Yes. Of the performance of it. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved off the lake, and she pulled his jacket tighter around her shoulders. My wife used to call it the other job, he said. The version of myself I had to put on to run the business. She could always tell when I'd been wearing it too long. He paused. She had a way of... She'd just make tea. She wouldn't say anything. She'd just come into whatever room I was in and make tea and sit down, and that was how I knew I was allowed to stop. Emily felt the ache of that land somewhere in her chest. The specificity of it. Not a grand gesture, not a speech, just tea and a quiet presence and permission. No one else makes tea like that anymore? She asked. No, he said simply. No one else knows to. They were both quiet for a while after that, and the quiet wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that was its own form of conversation. Two people sitting with the weight of honest things they'd said, not rushing to fill it with anything lighter. The city went on below them, bright and indifferent, and full of people living their various versions of this same night. Somewhere in the building, down a hallway she hadn't seen, Sophie was asleep with the hall light on against bad dreams, and Clara was in the guest room reading, and the apartment was everything Ethan had described, full of the evidence of a life being carefully maintained in the absence of the person who'd once made the maintenance feel lighter. "How do you do it?" Emily asked, not prying, genuinely asking. 4 years of it, doing it right. He took a moment with that. "I don't know that I'm doing it right," he said. "I'm doing it. Sophie she's good. She's happy, mostly. She has bad dreams sometimes, but she's not damaged by it, I don't think. At least that's what I tell myself." He paused. "And there are people around us, Clara, and some good friends, and the people at Sophie's school who know us well enough to check in. It's not nothing. But at the end of the day, you're still the only one awake." "Yes," he said, "still that." She looked at the lake. It was almost midnight, and the wind had gotten colder, and she should have been tired. She'd opened Cafe Vero at 5 that morning. She'd been on her feet for hours. She'd borrowed shoes that were half a size too small. But she wasn't tired. She was alert in the way she was when something was happening that she wanted to pay attention to. "I want to show you something," Ethan said. He went inside, and she followed, and he went to a bookshelf that lined the far wall of the living room and pulled down a photo album. Actual print photos, physical, the old-fashioned kind, and set it on the coffee table. She sat on the couch, and he sat beside her, and he opened it. The photos were of Sophie. Not all of them. The first pages were older, the paper slightly faded, showing a much younger Ethan in construction clothes standing outside what was clearly an early manufacturing facility, his face 15 years less complicated, his smile easier. Standing beside a woman Emily understood immediately, even before her brain processed the recognition. Dark-haired, serious eyes, a smile that was private rather than performed, her hand resting on Ethan's arm the way people touch things they were certain of. "Rachel," Ethan said quietly. Emily didn't say anything. She just looked. Rachel Calloway had a face that was kind in a specific way. Not soft, but genuinely interested. In the photos, she looked at whoever she was looking at with total attention. She looked at Ethan the way the anniversary couple at Holbrook's looked at each other, with the easy certainty of people who'd made a decision and weren't revisiting it. Then Sophie arrived in the album, a round, solemn infant in the first photos, then a wobbling toddler, then the explosion of personality that seemed to arrive somewhere around age 4, the photos getting more chaotic after that, more candid, one where Sophie was covered in what appeared to be chocolate and wearing a very serious expression. One where she'd fallen asleep face down on a stack of books, one where she was standing in what were clearly Ethan's shoes, 8 sizes too big, her hands on her hips and her chin tilted up, doing an impression of something. "She's doing me," Ethan said. "The shoes thing. She thinks that's what I look like when I'm at work." Emily smiled so hard her face hurt. "She's not entirely wrong." "No," he agreed. "She's not." They sat with the album between them, and she asked questions, and he answered them. Which school? Which birthday? What happened the week of the photo where Sophie had the black eye and the smug expression? She fell off a climbing structure and immediately asked if she could tell her friends she'd been in a fight. And it was the most domestic 20 minutes Emily had experienced in longer than she wanted to count. At some point the album was closed and they were just sitting on his couch, and she had finished her coffee, and he had finished his, and the city beyond the windows was doing what cities did past midnight. Quieter, but still present, still lit, the lake still enormous and dark beyond the skyline. "I should go," she said. He didn't argue it, which she was grateful for. "I'll have a car take you home," he said. "You don't have to—" "Emily." He looked at her. "Please let me do that one thing without it being a statement about the difference between our incomes." She looked at him, and then, because it was true and she was tired and the evening had made her honest in ways she didn't usually allow herself. "Okay, thank you." He nodded. She stood up and started to take off his jacket, and he said, "Keep it, it's cold." And she almost argued, and then she didn't, because it was cold and the shoes were already hurting her and she was choosing her battles. While he arranged the car, she stood by the refrigerator and looked at Sophie's purple horse. It was drawn with tremendous confidence. Thick crayon lines, no hesitation in the marks. the way children drew before they understood that other people were going to look at it and have opinions. The horse was purple because Sophie had decided it was purple. The horse was happy because Sophie had decided it was happy. The world in the drawing was exactly as Sophie had wanted it to be. Emily thought, I used to draw like that, before the studio folded, before the medical bills, before the 2 jobs and the borrowed dress, and the 11 days the invitation sat on her kitchen counter, while she convinced herself she wasn't afraid. She heard Ethan come back into the room, and she turned. 5 minutes, he said. The driver will text when he's outside. She nodded. They stood on either side of the kitchen island, and the apartment was quiet around them, and the city glowed through the windows. Tonight was... She started. Yes, he said before she could finish. She looked at him. You don't know what I was going to say. Something about it being unexpected. Something like that? It was, he said. Unexpected is the right word for it. A pause. The city. Sophie's sleeping presence somewhere down the hall light still on. I'd like to see you again, Ethan said. He said it the way he said things, directly, without dressing it up, with the specific quality of a person who decided something and was just reporting the decision. Emily looked at him. She thought about Jess and the borrowed dress and the way she'd come tonight to prove something to someone who wasn't worth proving anything to, and how none of that had turned out to be the point. That's probably complicated, she said. Yes, he agreed. You're... She gestured vaguely. And I know what I am, he said. And I know what tonight was. And I'm not trying to make it something you're not ready for. He held her gaze. I'm just being honest about where I am. She studied him for a moment. That direct, uncomplicated honesty that she kept waiting to turn out to be a performance and kept failing to find the seams of. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded. He seemed to find that acceptable, which meant he actually respected it, which was its own kind of answer. Her phone buzzed. The driver was outside. She walked to the door and he walked with her, and she had his jacket on and Jess's dress underneath it, and her 2 small heels and 11 months of accumulated exhaustion, and she stopped at the door. She turned around. Ethan Calloway was standing in his own doorway at midnight, in his own home, with the hall light on behind him, and a photo album on the coffee table, and a purple horse on his refrigerator. He looked like someone at the end of a long day. He looked like a person, is what he looked like. And that was the thing she couldn't get past. Not the penthouse, not the company, not the Forbes cover. Just this. Good night, Ethan, she said. Good night, Emily, he said. She walked to the elevator. She did not look back this time, and this time she was genuinely certain he was watching, and this time she was not afraid of what that meant. She was just thinking about it. The elevator came. She got in. The doors closed on the hall light still burning at the end of the corridor, and the city took her back down into itself. And Emily Carter rode home in the back of a car that smelled like leather and pressed her face briefly against the cold window and watched Chicago slide past and thought about a man who left a set of keys on a hook by the door because moving them would mean something he wasn't ready for. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about it all the way home and standing in her apartment under the yellow lamp, and for most of the 3 hours it took her to fall asleep. She didn't hear from him for 3 days. Emily told herself that was fine. She told herself it was expected, actually, that whatever had happened at the gala and afterward in his apartment was the kind of thing that made complete sense in the bubble of a single evening, and then dissolved in daylight the way certain dreams did, leaving you with only the feeling and none of the logic. She told herself that Ethan Calloway had a company and a daughter and a life that operated at a scale she couldn't fully picture, and that she had a 5A, Mr. Alarm and a coffee machine and a stack of rubber-banded bills, and that the two of them sitting on his couch looking at photo albums past midnight was a lovely and unrepeatable thing that she was going to carry quietly and not make strange by expecting it to continue. She was very convincing when she talked to herself. She was less convincing when she was wiping down the espresso machine at Cafe Vero at 7:15 and found herself checking her phone between customers. The regular at 7:15 came in, and she set his drink on the counter before he reached her, and he looked at it, and then at her and said, "You always know." And she smiled and said, "Habit," and the interaction took 11 seconds and cost her nothing, and she thought about Ethan telling her that story had been worth hearing. She went home after her shift. She made pasta because it was cheap and required minimal decisions. She sat at her kitchen table and opened her laptop and pulled up 3 half-finished freelance design inquiries she'd been putting off, and stared at them for 40 minutes and closed the laptop. She called Jess on the second night. "He said he wanted to see you again?" Jess asked, for the third time, like she needed to run it through her system a few more times to process it. He said it like it was just a fact, like he was telling me what time it was. That's either very confident or very strange. "I keep going back and forth on which," Emily admitted. "Have you heard from him?" "No." "Are you waiting to hear from him?" Emily looked at the water stain on the ceiling. "I'm not waiting," she said. "I'm just aware of the possibility of hearing from him." "Emily, I know. That's waiting." "I know," she said again. She slept badly that night and worked the weekend shift at Holbrook's, and the anniversary couple came in on Friday as always and held hands across the table, and she looked at them and thought about a man leaving a set of keys on a hook by the door, because moving them to a drawer meant admitting something he wasn't ready for. She thought about it while she recited the specials and poured the water and smiled at the right moments. On the third day, her phone buzzed with a number she didn't have saved. "I thought you should know that Sophie has informed me raisins are, and I quote, basically a trick. I told her a woman I met recently said the same thing. She wants to know your name so she can thank you properly." E. Emily read it twice. Then she sat down on her kitchen floor, which was not a normal thing to do but felt necessary, and read it a third time. She was smiling. She was aware she was smiling, and she wasn't doing anything about it. She typed back, "Tell her Emily. And tell her raisins and cookies are the worst kind because they disguise themselves as chocolate chips. That's not a mistake, that's a choice." The response came in under 2 minutes. She said exactly. "She's very serious about this. I think you found your people." Emily looked at the ceiling from her kitchen floor for a while. Then she typed, "How are you?" A longer pause this time. She could feel the consideration in it. "Tired. Good kind of tired. We went to the Natural History Museum today. Sophie spent 45 minutes in front of the blue whale and didn't move. I don't know what she was thinking about. I didn't ask." "Why not?" "Some things you watch without interrupting." Emily read that and something in her chest settled in a way that had nothing to do with romance. It was simpler than that. It was the recognition of a person who understood that the right response to certain moments was just presence. She'd spent years around people who couldn't tolerate a silence without filling it, and here was this man choosing to stand next to his daughter and a whale and not say a word. "That's good parenting," she typed, "or cowardice. I'm genuinely not sure which." "Sometimes they're the same thing," she wrote back, and then before she could think about it, "I'd like to see you again too. If that still stands." The pause this time was longer, long enough that she put the phone face down on the kitchen floor and looked at the ceiling and had a very direct internal conversation about what she was doing. Then, "Saturday, dinner, somewhere that's not a gala. I'll pick you up at 7. And that was how it began. Not the gala, not the dance, not the penthouse, or the photo album, or the purple horse on the refrigerator. Those were all overture. It began on a Saturday in late November when a black car pulled up in front of her building on the north side, and she walked out in her own dress. Not borrowed, her actual dress, dark green, slightly rumpled from being folded in the back of her closet, and she'd decided not to pretend otherwise. And Ethan Calloway was standing outside the car instead of waiting inside it. He was in dark jeans and a gray sweater, and he looked more like a person than he had at the gala, less like the magazine cover. "You didn't have to stand outside," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to see you walk out." She stopped. "That's a lot to lead with." "I told you I'd rather just say the thing." She looked at him for a moment, this man who apparently said all his things directly and without apology, and she thought, this is either going to be very good or very hard, and I'm not sure there's a version where it's both. "Okay," she said, "let's go." The restaurant was not what she expected. It was small, deliberately so. A 12-table place on the near west side called Mirandi's that had no sign outside and required a reservation 3 weeks in advance, the kind of restaurant that was known by the people who knew it and completely invisible to everyone else. The lighting was low and honest, and the menu was handwritten and changed daily, and the owner came to the table himself and shook Ethan's hand and called him by his first name. "You're a regular," Emily said when the owner had gone. "I come when I need to think," Ethan said. "They don't have a private room. Nobody has meetings here, it's just food." "Do you have a lot of places like that? Places that are just one thing without the other thing attached?" He thought about it. "Less than I should," he said. She ordered the duck because it was what she wanted, and it was the second most expensive thing on the menu, and she'd made a decision in the car that she wasn't going to monitor her choices the way she might have with someone else. Wasn't going to order the pasta because it was the sensible option. Wasn't going to position herself as someone who didn't want things. She wanted the duck. She ordered the duck. Ethan noticed, she could tell. Not with any comment, just a slight shift in expression, something that looked almost like relief. "Tell me about the design work," he said when they were settled. "Not the studio closing. Before that, what you were actually doing." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because when you talked about it at the gala, you went somewhere else. Your whole face changed." She hadn't known he'd noticed that. "I was building brand identities, she said, slowly at first, then with more momentum as the material took over. Mostly for small businesses, restaurants, boutiques, a couple of nonprofits. The challenge of it is, every business has something it thinks it is, and something it actually is. And usually those are different, and part of the job is figuring out the difference and making the visual language match the real thing instead of the fantasy." She paused. "I'm good at seeing the gap between what someone thinks they're presenting and what they're actually putting out." "That's an unusual skill," he said. "It got me in trouble sometimes," she said, "but clients don't always want to know the gap. They want confirmation that what they think is what it is." "But you told them anyway." "I tried to do it gently," she said. "Mostly it worked. Sometimes it didn't." He was looking at her with that attentive quality she'd come to expect from him, the quality of actual listening. "The studio that folded," he said. "Was it just financial, or was there more to it?" She'd expected the question eventually. She hadn't expected to not mind answering it. "The owner was my mentor," she said. "Marcus. He'd been running it for 12 years, built it from nothing. He was not good at the business side. He was extraordinary at the work and genuinely terrible at everything else. And he kept thinking the next good project would fix the infrastructure problems, instead of building the infrastructure so good projects could keep coming." She paused. "He's doing consulting now, freelance, he's okay. But watching it close was..." She stopped. It felt like watching something real get canceled. "Like it didn't have to happen," Ethan said. "Exactly like that." He turned his glass in his hands. That habitual gesture she recognized now. "I've watched businesses close that didn't have to," he said. "Ones where the work was good and the people were good, and it just came apart because of something fixable that nobody fixed in time." He was quiet for a moment. "It's a specific kind of grief. You keep running the alternative timeline." "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what it is." They ate. The food was real. Not the kind of cooking that announced itself, but the kind that made you aware of being hungry and then satisfied that specific hunger precisely. She ate the duck, and he had the lamb, and they shared a side of roasted potatoes that arrived slightly too hot, and they both burned their mouths a little, and neither of them mentioned it. She told him about her brother, not the version she'd offered at the gala, the proud older sister version, but the actual version, which involved more anxiety and more money, and more 11 p.m. texts that started, "Hey, don't tell Mom, but," and required her to make a decision in the dark about whether she could cover something she technically couldn't cover. "His name is Ryan," she said. "He's 22 and he's better than he thinks he is. He grew up watching me leave and watching our mom work 3 jobs, and he has this idea that wanting things is dangerous, that the wanting is where the pain is." "Where did you get the opposite idea?" Ethan asked. She thought about it. "I'm not sure I did," she said honestly. "I wanted things and got hurt by it plenty. I just decided the alternative was worse. Wanting things that don't happen versus not wanting things and having the nothing you planned for." She met his eyes across the table. "I'd rather have the first kind of hurt." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's the right call." She thought about his keys on the hook by the door. She thought about 4 years of the right kind of hurt. After dinner, he asked if she wanted to walk, and she said yes, and they walked along the riverfront in the November cold, the Chicago River doing its dark, purposeful thing beside them, the bridges lit up in yellow against a sky that was more orange than black. She had a real coat this time, her own, the navy wool one that was starting to show its age at the cuffs but was still good. And he walked beside her with his hands in his pockets, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched when the path narrowed. "Can I ask you something about Rachel?" she said when they'd been walking long enough that it felt like the right ground. "Yes," he said, not tense, not braced, just open. "What did she think about the business? Did she like it?" He was quiet for a few steps. "She was proud of it," he said. "She understood why it mattered to me, which was more than most people did early on. But she had—" he paused. "She had reservations about the version of me it required sometimes. The part that had to be public and managed and performing. She thought that version was costing me something." "Was she right?" "Probably," he said. "She usually was, which was genuinely irritating." Emily smiled. "Did you tell her that?" "I told her frequently that she was right, and that it still frustrated me, and she seemed to find that acceptable." "That sounds like a good arrangement." "It was," he said simply. They walked past a bridge, and the river moved below them, and a few other people were out in the cold doing the same thing they were, walking without particular destination, which was its own category of activity in a city like Chicago, where you were usually going somewhere. "I'm not trying to replace her," Emily said quietly. She needed to say it. She didn't know if he needed to hear it, but she needed to say it. "Whatever this is, I want to be clear that I understand. She's not something you move on from. She's just part of who you are." Ethan stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The river went on. A cab went by on the street above, its lights orange in the dark. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet. Not the quiet directness, not the contained sadness, not the almost smile. Something more open than any of those. Like she'd said something that had reached past the careful containment of him and landed somewhere unguarded. "Thank you," he said. "Just that." She nodded. They stood there for a moment at the railing above the river, close enough now that it wasn't incidental, and he reached out and touched her hand. Just briefly, his fingers over hers on the cold railing, not holding, just placing. Like he was learning the geography of a thing he wasn't ready to hold yet. She didn't move her hand. They stood there in the November cold above the dark river, and the city turned around them, and Emily Carter, who'd come to a charity gala 3 weeks ago and borrowed shoes to prove something to someone who wasn't worth it, stood next to this man and felt quietly and with no ceremony whatsoever like the evening was exactly what it was supposed to be. They kept seeing each other. It wasn't dramatic the way it built. That was the thing Emily kept noticing, kept finding slightly disorienting. She'd expected drama from a situation this improbable, had braced for the moment it became something she couldn't manage. Instead, it was just dinners, walks, a Sunday afternoon when he'd texted to say he and Sophie were at the Art Institute, and Sophie wanted to know if Emily liked horses, and Emily had said yes, which was not entirely a lie, and he'd sent back a photo of Sophie standing in front of a large painting with an expression of total authority, her small arms crossed, like she'd curated it personally. Emily had looked at that photo for a long time. She met Sophie 3 weeks after the gala, which felt both soon and inevitable, and it happened the way these things sometimes happened, not planned exactly, more like the situation arrived before the plan did. Ethan had mentioned Sophie was coming with him to pick up an order from a bookstore near Emily's neighborhood, and he'd mentioned Emily was in the area, and Sophie had apparently said, "So can we see her?" with the blunt logical certainty of a 7-year-old. And Ethan had called Emily and explained this sequence of events with the slightly helpless tone of a person who had learned not to argue with Sophie's logic. Emily had said yes, and then stood in her apartment for 4 minutes being more nervous than she'd been at the gala. They met outside the bookstore. Sophie appeared from behind Ethan's leg when Emily approached. Not shy, exactly, more like assessing, the way cats decided whether to trust people before committing to anything. She had Ethan's eyes and what Emily guessed was Rachel's coloring and a very serious expression for someone wearing light-up sneakers. "You're Emily," Sophie said. "I am," Emily said. "Dad said you agree about raisins." "Completely," Emily said. They're deceptive and no one talks about it enough. Sophie looked at her for another moment. Do you like horses? I do, Emily said. I like the ones that look like they have opinions. Sophie appeared to find this correct. She reached out and took Emily's hand, just grabbed it, no preamble, with the confidence of a child who didn't yet understand there were people who didn't want to be grabbed, and said, okay, and started walking toward the bookstore entrance. Emily looked back at Ethan. He was watching with an expression she didn't have a word for yet. Not surprised, more like something settling into place, something he'd been waiting to see and was now seeing. He caught her eye and looked slightly embarrassed at having been caught, and she turned forward before either of them had to deal with it. Sophie picked out 3 books about horses and one about deep-sea creatures, which she explained was for variety, and she explained this to the bookseller with tremendous seriousness, while Emily stood beside her and Ethan paid. Then they walked to a coffee shop 2 doors down, and Sophie had hot chocolate, and Emily had coffee, and Ethan had coffee, and Sophie told Emily extensively about a girl in her class named Madison who had claimed that horses weren't as smart as dolphins, and Sophie's position on this was extremely developed and included several supporting arguments. Emily engaged with this seriously, because it deserved serious engagement. Ethan sat across from them and drank his coffee and watched his daughter talk to Emily and said very little. And Emily was aware of his watching in the peripheral way you were aware of weather. Not intrusive, just present. When they parted outside, Sophie hugged Emily goodbye with the same zero preamble certainty with which she had taken her hand, and then said, "You can come to the museum sometime if you want," in the tone of a very significant invitation. And Emily said she would like that very much. Sophie went ahead to the car. Ethan stayed. "She doesn't do that with everyone," he said. "The museum invitation? Any of it." He looked at her. She's careful with new people, usually." Emily thought about Sophie's hand in hers and the 3 horse books and the argument about dolphins. "She was testing me," Emily said. "The raisin thing, the horse thing. She was checking if I was real." Ethan looked at her. "Yeah," he said quietly. "She was." "Did I pass?" "She invited you to the museum," he said. "Yes, you passed." Something in Emily's chest did the complicated thing it had been doing for 3 weeks now, the thing she didn't have precise language for. She looked at him standing on the sidewalk in the November gray, his daughter waiting in the car behind him, his eyes on her with that quality of actually looking. "I'm starting to feel things," she said. Out loud, which she hadn't planned. "About this situation, about you. I wanted you to know because I don't like pretending I'm not." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "I started feeling things the moment you walked across that dance floor and asked a stranger to help you survive the evening." He paused. "I didn't say anything because I was trying to be careful about what I was asking you to step into. And now?" He held her gaze. "Now Sophie's in the car telling the driver about dolphins, and I'm standing on a sidewalk, and I'd like to stop being careful for 10 seconds. She looked at him. 10 seconds, she said. Just 10. He stepped forward and kissed her. Not tentative, not a question. One clear, unhurried moment, his hand coming up to her jaw, the cold air around them and the city noise, and none of it registering fully because he kissed her the way he did everything else, with complete intention and no performance of it. It lasted exactly as long as it needed to. When he stepped back, she looked at him, and her heart was doing something very loud. "More than 10 seconds, she said. "I'm bad at being careful," he said. She laughed, and he looked at her laughing, and Sophie's voice came from the direction of the car. "Dad, are you coming?" With the infinite patience of a 7-year-old who had no patience. "Go," Emily said. He went. She stood on the sidewalk in November and watched the car pull away and put her hand briefly against her own cheek where his had been, and then felt very aware of the street around her and took her hand down and walked home. She called Jess before she'd reached the end of the block. "He kissed you," Jess said, 10 seconds into the call. "How did you—" "I was calling to tell you." "Your voice said it before your words did." A pause. "How was it?" Emily thought about it. It felt like when you're reading a sentence and all the words finally click and you understand what it's been saying. "Emily, I know. You're in trouble." "I know," Emily said. Good trouble or bad trouble? She looked at the city around her, the gray November sky, the familiar street, the life she'd been building and rebuilding and carrying for years on her own, the 2 jobs and the bills and the 4 plans, none of them funded. And she thought about a man who talked to his daughter about dolphins and left keys on a hook by the door and said the things he meant because he'd decided pretending wasn't worth the energy. "I'm not sure yet," she said honestly, "but I think I have to find out." Jess was quiet for a moment. Then, "The dress still needs dry cleaning, by the way." "I know. I'm putting it on your tab." "Add it to the list," Emily said, and she was smiling, and the November cold was just cold, and she walked home. Over the weeks that followed, they found a rhythm that nobody planned. It was not a storybook rhythm. It was a real one, with all the friction real things had. There were evenings when Ethan was unreachable because the Pacific contract had a complication, or because Sophie was sick, or because the weight of running a company across 3 time zones meant he didn't surface until 9 o'clock, and by then Emily was already in bed with her alarm set for 4:45. There were mornings when she was short-tempered from exhaustion, and he'd ask a simple question, and she'd hear an edge in her own voice that she hadn't intended, and have to decide whether to address it or let it go. They mostly addressed it. That was new for her. She had a pattern. She'd learned it young from watching her mother absorb things silently, of not saying the difficult thing until the difficult thing had been sitting long enough to ferment into something worse. With Ethan, she kept finding herself saying the thing while it was still small. Not because she'd decided to be different, but because he created the specific condition in which saying it felt safer than holding it. He noticed when she was quiet in the wrong way, not intrusively. He'd just be there, in the particular way he'd described Rachel being there with the tea. Not asking, just present, and she'd find herself talking. "You're doing it again," she told him once, on a Thursday evening when she'd had a brutal double shift and he'd brought food to her apartment, which he'd started doing in a low-key way that she'd decided not to examine too closely. "Doing what?" "The thing where you just wait, and I end up talking." He looked at her over the takeout containers. "I'm not doing anything. I'm eating lo mein." "You're doing it while eating lo mein." He picked up his chopsticks. "Is it working?" She looked at him. "The coffee shop offered me extra hours this month, but it means I can't work on the freelance stuff I've been trying to rebuild, and I can't figure out which one to give up, and I feel like I'm always choosing between the thing that pays and the thing that matters." He nodded, not immediately offering a solution, which was the thing she'd learned to appreciate. He didn't reach for fixes the way some people did, the way she'd been trained to expect men to reach for fixes. He just listened first. "Which feels worse to give up this month?" he asked. "The design work," she said, "even though the money from the shop is guaranteed." "Then keep the design work." "Ethan, I need the money." "What's the gap?" he asked, "between what you'd lose from fewer shop hours and what you need?" She told him. She told him with the specific, slightly braced quality of a person who had learned that mentioning money in a particular way with a particular kind of person led to a particular kind of offer she didn't want. He didn't make the offer. What he said was, "Okay, so you need 3 clients at the rate you usually charge to cover that gap in 2 months. What's stopping you from getting 3 clients?" She looked at him. "Time. I've been so tired I haven't sent pitches." "What would you need to send pitches this week?" 3 hours I don't have." "You have Sunday morning," he said. "Sophie's at her grandmother's. I'm meeting with Jenkins, which I can do from here. You could work at the kitchen table." She stared at him. "You're offering me table space." "I'm offering you table space and coffee," he said, "which I will make correctly since apparently I've been making it wrong according to your extremely specific opinions. You use too much water. You've mentioned it 4 times. Because it's important." She looked at him. "You're not going to try to just fix it financially." "No," he said. "Even though you could." "Yes," he said simply, "because that's not what you need and it's not what you asked for." He met her eyes. "You need 3 hours and table space. That's what I can give you." She held his gaze for a moment, and she felt something shift, not dramatically, not with any announcement, just a quiet settling, the way ground settled when the thing that had been loose in it found its level. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said, and picked up his lo mein. She came on Sunday. She sat at his kitchen table with her laptop and her coffee, made correctly after a second attempt and a brief negotiation about the ratio, and she sent 5 pitches in 3 hours while Ethan sat across the room on a conference call with Jenkins and spoke in the flat, decisive vocabulary of someone who handled large numbers without drama. Sophie was at her grandmother's. The apartment was quiet. The lake was gray through the windows, a December gray low sky, and the kind of light that made everything look considered. 2 of the 5 pitches responded within the week. She didn't tell Ethan it had worked immediately. She waited a day, let it be real, and then she texted him. 2 clients. The raisin stance is paying off. Tell Sophie she's good luck. He responded, she'll be insufferable about this. I want you to know that's your fault. She was at Holbrook's when she got that message, standing by the server station between courses, and she smiled at her phone with the involuntary smile that she was increasingly giving up trying to suppress. And the other server, a college student named Max, who had been watching the situation develop from a distance for several weeks, said, "That's him, isn't it?" And she said, "Mind the table, Max." And he said, "Yeah, that's him." And she was still smiling when she went back out. December moved. She was at his apartment more than she'd planned, and he was at hers more than she'd expected, anyone that clean-lined and used to space would tolerate. He sat on her couch, which was slightly too small, and ate the pasta she made, which was not as good as Mirandi's, and he never once made her feel the difference between their lives as a verdict. She kept waiting for it. That was the honest thing. She kept waiting for the moment it would surface, the unconscious condescension, the small adjustment of expectations, the implication that she was being accommodated rather than chosen. She'd seen enough of how people with money thought about people without it to know it didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it was just a tone, a pause, the way someone held a door. It didn't come. What came instead were evenings like the Thursday, with the lo mein, and the Sunday with the table space, and a dozen small moments where Ethan Calloway demonstrated, without ceremony, that he saw her, not the circumstances around her, not the gap between their bank accounts, not the borrowed dress or the too small shoes, but her specifically, Emily Carter, the person who understood the gap between what things presented and what they actually were. She understood the irony of being seen that clearly by someone she'd spent weeks trying to categorize. She understood it, and she didn't fight it anymore. What she fought, instead, was the specific fear she'd been carrying since the night she walked out of his apartment in her borrowed dress with his jacket around her shoulders. The fear that the further in she went, the further she had to fall. Because she knew what she was doing, she was not a person who deceived herself for long. She knew she was falling for Ethan Calloway in the genuine and unstrategic way that people fell for people when they'd stopped being careful about it. And falling, in her experience, had a gravity that didn't ask permission. She was thinking about this, in the abstract, unresolved way she thought about things she hadn't decided yet. On a Friday evening in mid-December, when she arrived at his apartment and found him sitting at the kitchen island in his work clothes with his tie off and his laptop open and an expression she'd learned to read as a specific kind of exhausted, not physical, but the other kind. "Bad day?" she asked. "Long one," he said. She went to the kitchen and made 2 coffees, correctly with the right water ratio, and set one in front of him and stood across the island. He looked up at her, at the coffee, back at her. "Thank you," he said. "What happened?" He told her. A contractor dispute that had been simmering for 3 months had escalated into something that was going to require litigation, and 3 of his senior engineers had a disagreement about the next model's design direction that he'd had to sit in the middle of for 2 hours, and Sophie had cried that morning because she'd had the bad dream again and the hall light hadn't helped. And he'd stood outside her bedroom door for 5 minutes after she fell back asleep, doing the specific internal calculation of a parent trying to figure out whether their child needed something they weren't providing. He told her all of it, which he wouldn't have done 2 months ago. She knew that because she knew him now, knew the careful containment of him, the instinct to manage rather than disclose. He was learning, slowly, to put things down somewhere other than inside himself. She listened. She drank her coffee. She didn't rush to fix any of it. When he was done, she said, "Sophie's going to be okay. The bad dreams aren't evidence of something wrong. They're just dreams." "I know that intellectually," he said, "but at 5 in the morning, the intellectual version is useless. Completely useless," he agreed. "She knows she can come to you," Emily said. "That's the thing. She already knows. You've already done the important part." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached across the island and covered her hand with his. Not the tentative placement on the railing by the river, not the gala, not the riverfront. Something more straightforward than those. The gesture of a person who had decided and was not revisiting the decision. "I'm glad you're here," he said. She turned her hand over under his. "Me too," she said. And that was the night. Not the gala, not the kiss on the sidewalk, that felt like the real beginning of something. Not because anything dramatic happened, because nothing needed to. They sat in his kitchen drinking coffee while the December dark pressed against the windows and the lake was somewhere beyond the city, enormous and patient, and Emily Carter stopped waiting for the thing she was afraid of and let herself be exactly where she was. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the first time in a long time that what she had and what she wanted were the same thing, and she was not going to minimize that by looking for what could go wrong. That would come soon enough on its own. It always did. But for this night, in this kitchen, she was here, and she was staying. It started with a photograph. Not one photograph. Dozens of them, uploaded to 3 different celebrity gossip accounts within the same hour on a Monday morning in late December, 6 weeks after the Hargrove Gala. Emily found out the way most people found out about things that were happening to them, from someone else who'd seen it first. Jess called at 7:42, while Emily was still on the opening shift at Cafe Vero before the morning rush had fully arrived, before she'd had her own coffee. "Don't freak out," Jess said, which was the single most reliable way to make Emily freak out. "What happened?" "There are photos from the gala of you and Ethan." A pause. "A lot of photos." Emily set down the portafilter she was holding. "How many is a lot?" They're everywhere, Em. The big gossip sites have them. There's a piece on 2 financial news blogs. Someone got a shot of you in his jacket outside the venue, and there's another one of you two at the corner table at Mirandi's from, it must have been one of the early dinners. Someone followed you." The word landed wrong. Someone followed us. Or followed him specifically. I don't know. Jess's voice had the quality it got when she was trying to stay calm for someone else's sake, which meant the situation was bad enough that staying calm was an active effort. "The captions are..." She stopped. "Tell me." "Calloway's mystery woman. Who is the waitress Ethan Calloway can't stop seeing? There's one that says..." Another pause. "There's one that says gold digger or genuine article. And there's a whole comment section that is..." "Okay," Emily said. "I don't need to hear the comment section. Are you okay?" Emily looked at the coffee shop around her. The 7:15 regular hadn't come in yet. The morning light was doing its flat December thing through the front windows. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 10 minutes ago. "I'm going to call you back," she said. She put her phone in her apron pocket and finished setting up the station and served 3 customers on autopilot. And then she pulled out her phone in the 30-second gap between the 3rd and 4th customer and looked. It was worse than Jess had made it sound, which was impressive given that Jess had not undersold it. The photos from the gala were the most prominent, professional quality, probably pulled from the event photographer's gallery or from someone's phone who'd been close enough on the dance floor. There was one where Ethan had his hand at her back and was looking at her with an expression she recognized now, but that read, to a stranger's eye, as something intense and deliberate and intimate. There was the moment when he'd spoken to Daniel. She could see Daniel at the edge of the frame, his expression doing the thing it had done, and Ethan turned toward him with that flat, shutting down quality. And whoever had taken that one had caught the stillness in the room around them. It looked dramatic because it had been dramatic, and now it was a thing that strangers were assigning captions to. The Mirandi's photo was worse somehow. Not because of what was in it, but because of what it implied. 2 people at a small table in a restaurant that required a reservation weeks in advance, leaning toward each other, her hand on the table close to his. It was a private moment. It had been private. And now it was a comment section. "Who brings a waitress to Mirandi's LOL? She's not even that pretty. TBH classic Calloway. Bet she's been playing him since the gala. Working class queen, honestly good for her. Working class grifter, more like." She locked her phone. The 7:15 regular came in. She made his drink and set it on the counter. "You remembered," he said. "Habit," she said, and she meant it to come out normally, and it mostly did. By 10 o'clock, the story had been picked up by two mainstream entertainment sites and a financial news outlet that framed it as a potential distraction for Callaway Automotive during ongoing contract negotiations, which was the version that made her stomach turn hardest. Not the personal attacks, but the suggestion that she was a liability to something he'd built over 20 years. She texted Ethan at 10:15. "Have you seen it?" The response came in under a minute. "I've seen it. Are you okay?" She looked at that question for a moment. Such a specific, quiet question in the middle of something that felt loud in every direction. "I'm at work," she typed. "I'm okay. Are you?" "I've been better. Can you come over tonight?" Yes. She worked her full shift. She did not look at her phone again until she was outside, because she was at work, and customers deserved a person who was present, and she was not going to let this take that from her. She made drinks, and ran the register, and restocked the pastry case, and wiped the counter, and did all the small specific tasks that made up a shift, and she was good at them, and she held on to that. But she read the comments on her lunch break. She told herself she wouldn't, and she did it anyway, the way you pressed on a bruise to measure the damage. And it was about what she'd expected, and also worse than she'd expected, in the particular way that mass contempt from strangers was always worse in the experiencing than in the anticipating. The theme was consistent, even across the different platforms. There was the version that was sympathetic, working girl, lucky break, good for her, fairy tale stuff. She hated that version almost as much as the other one, because it had the same fundamental assumption underneath it, that she was a circumstance that had happened to Ethan Callaway, not a person he'd chosen. The other version, the gold digger framing, the grifter narrative, the comments about her appearance and her income and her motives, those were uglier and more direct and hurt in a cleaner way. She locked her phone again and finished her lunch. The financial news piece was the one that stayed with her on the bus home. It wasn't gossipy. It was dry and specific, and that made it more damaging in a way she understood from her design work, because the medium implied credibility. Sources close to Callaway Automotive suggest the relationship has raised internal concerns ahead of the Q1 investor meetings, where optics and executive stability have historically been key factors in securing confidence from the board. It quoted no one by name. It didn't need to. She called her mother from the bus. She hadn't planned to, but her mother had texted 6 times since 10 a.m., and ignoring it further felt like its own kind of unkindness. "Emily Marie Carter," her mother said, which was how she knew the level she was operating at. "Hi, Mom. I'm looking at a picture of you on the internet wearing a man's jacket." "I know. Who is this man?" "His name is Ethan. I've been seeing him for about 6 weeks." "Emily, this man is—" She heard her mother pull up something on a phone or laptop. "It says here he's worth—" "Emily, it says—" "I know what it says." "Were you going to tell me?" She pressed her forehead briefly against the cold bus window. "I was going to tell you when I knew what to tell you." "And what do you know now?" She thought about the kitchen island, the low main, the table space on Sunday mornings, the way he'd said, "I told you I'd rather just say the thing," and then proceeded to say it every time, even when it cost him something. "I know he's a good person," she said. "I know he has a daughter I really like. I know the rest of it is—" She gestured at nothing, at the bus, at the city moving past the window. "Complicated." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Are they being mean to you? Online?" "Some of them. Don't read it." "I know." "Emily, do not read it." "Mom, I'm serious. Nothing good comes from reading what strangers think of you. Nothing. I learned that when your father left and people had opinions about it, and I made the mistake of listening." Her voice went to that specific register. Not soft, but honest, the register her mother used when she was handing something over. "You've been alone a long time, baby. If this man is good and he treats you right, then the strangers on the internet can say whatever they want." Emily felt her eyes get hot, which she hadn't expected. "He's good," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "Then that's what matters," her mother said. "The rest is noise." She said goodbye and got off the bus and walked the 2 blocks to her apartment in the December cold, and stood in the middle of her kitchen for a moment, just standing, letting the day settle. Then she changed out of her work clothes and went to Ethan's. He was in the kitchen when she arrived, which meant Clara had the evening covered for Sophie, and he had his sleeves rolled up, and there was a pan on the stove that he was paying attention to with the focused expression of someone who cooked the way he did most things, with complete intention and limited natural talent. "You're cooking," she said. "Attempting to," he said. "Pasta. Clara left me instructions." "You have instructions." "Clara doesn't trust me unsupervised near a stove." He looked at her from across the kitchen. "How are you actually?" She thought about the right answer. She thought about the measured, "I'm fine" version and the truer version underneath it. "I read the comments," she said. "I told myself I wouldn't, and I did." He turned the burner down and came around the island. He didn't reach for her immediately. He stopped a foot away, looking at her, checking something in her face with that direct attention. "I'm sorry," he said. "You didn't take the photos." "I know. I'm still sorry it happened." He paused. "The financial piece, the one that mentioned the board. I read that one too." He was quiet for a moment. "None of that is your problem to manage." "It is, though," she said. "Not legally or professionally, but if being with me creates a narrative that hurts something you've built for 20 years, that's not nothing. I can't just decide that's not my concern because it's uncomfortable to think about." He looked at her. "Emily, I'm being serious. So am I." He held her gaze. "The board is not your concern. The investors are not your concern. The people who think my personal life is leverage for anything, they were always going to find something. Before you, it was the settlement after Rachel died. Before that, it was a supplier disagreement that became a narrative about my temperament." He said it evenly, like he was reading from a document he'd read before. "There is always a story. I've stopped managing the story and started managing the actual things." She looked at him. "And I'm an actual thing?" "You're the most actual thing I've dealt with in 4 years," he said, and it came out more plainly than either of them had braced for. She was quiet for a moment. The pasta water was doing something on the stove behind him. "Your pasta's about to overflow," she said. He turned and caught the pot and turned the burner down and said something under his breath that was definitely not appropriate for Sophie's ears. And Emily laughed despite everything, the involuntary laugh that came out when she wasn't monitoring anything, and the kitchen filled briefly with the sound of it, and it was better than silence. They made dinner together, which was mostly Emily making dinner while Ethan managed the parts that didn't require precision and relayed Clara's written instructions with great seriousness. They ate at the kitchen table, and Sophie came out in her pajamas at 7:30 to say goodnight and saw Emily and said, "You're here," with the flat surprise of a child who had not factored this into her evening plan but was not opposed to it. And then she showed Emily a drawing she'd done of a horse running on water, which she explained was a new kind of horse. And Emily looked at it with great seriousness and said it was excellent, and Sophie seemed to find this acceptable and went back to bed. Clara appeared briefly in the kitchen doorway, assessed the situation, said good night to both of them in a tone that contained absolutely no judgment but also a great deal of awareness, and disappeared back down the hall. "She knows," Emily said. "Clara knows everything," Ethan said. I stopped trying to figure out how. After dinner, they sat on his couch. Sophie's horse drawing spread across the coffee table from an earlier session, and they talked about it. Properly, not around it. He told her what Jenkins had told him about the board inquiry, which was less dire than the financial piece had implied, and she told him what her mother had said on the bus, and they talked about what they were willing to do and what they weren't. "I'm not going quiet on this," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not going to manage you like a PR problem." "I'm not asking you to." "I know you're not. I'm telling you because some people would." He met her eyes. "My last publicist's exact suggestion was that I issue a statement explaining we'd met through a mutual acquaintance and that you'd designed work for a company in my portfolio." He paused. "I fired her." Emily stared at him. "You fired your publicist?" "She suggested I reframe you as a professional contact to protect the optics. I found that to be an unacceptable suggestion." "Ethan, I don't want you firing people because of me." She'd been making suggestions like that for 2 years, he said. "It wasn't just you. It was a pattern." He said it with the calm of someone who'd made the decision and moved past it. "I'll hire someone who understands that managing my image doesn't include revising what I'm actually doing." She looked at him. You don't do the strategic thing." "I told you," he said. "I'm very bad at it. It's going to keep causing you problems." "Probably," he agreed. "I've made peace with it." She looked at the horse drawings on the coffee table and thought about the version of events she'd been bracing for. The apology, the gentle walking back, the language of course you matter, but, that she'd learned to listen for in men who wanted to want the right thing without paying the cost of it. She'd been preparing for it since she'd read the comments on her lunch break. She'd been building the wall against it on the bus ride over. It hadn't come, and she realized, sitting there, that she was still halfway braced for it, still waiting for the version of Ethan that the situation seemed to demand. The careful executive, the man with the board and the investors and the optics. And he kept not being that man. He was just the man on the couch with Sophie's horse drawings and the pasta Clara had left instructions for. "The company all hands is Thursday," he said. She looked at him. He had a specific quality in his expression. The one she'd learned meant he'd decided something and was about to report it. "Okay," she said carefully. "The board wants a statement from me about—" He gestured at the general situation. "Personal conduct, the standard language, appropriate professional judgment, etc. Are you going to give them one?" "I'm going to say something," he said. "Whether it matches what they had in mind is a different question." She looked at him for a long moment. "What are you planning?" "I'm planning to tell the truth," he said, "which is that there is a person in my life who is not a narrative and not a liability and not a PR situation, and anyone in that room who treats her like one of those things answers to me." The room was quiet. The December wind was doing something to the windows. That specific Chicago pressure of a lake wind pushing against glass. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know. It's going to make the news piece look mild. I know that too. Ethan." She turned on the couch to look at him properly. "I don't need you to fight for me publicly. I don't need you to make a statement. I'm not asking for that." "I know you're not," he said. "But there are about 400 employees in that room, and they've been reading the same pieces you read today. And some of them are going to come into that meeting thinking—" He stopped. "Thinking what you were afraid of, that you're a situation I need to manage, and I'm not willing to let that be the story they walk out with." She looked at him. She thought about the comment sections and the financial piece and the word gold digger in a headline attached to her name, and she thought about how little she'd been able to do about any of it, except lock her phone and keep working. And she thought about this man sitting on a couch telling her he was going to walk into a room full of his employees and investors and say the true thing about her. "You're going to make everything more complicated," she said. "I'm very good at that too," he said. She felt something move in her chest. Not the tentative provisional thing it had been at the gala, not the careful watching thing it had been in the weeks since. Something more settled and more frightening. She reached over and took his hand. He looked down at their hands on the couch cushion. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay?" "Say the thing," she said. "If that's what you're going to do it." He was quiet for a moment. The city pressed against the windows. Sophie was asleep down the hall with the light on. "I need to tell you something else," he said. She waited. "The person I was at the gala, the one who'd been sitting alone for an hour because standing in a room of people felt harder than it should. I've been like that for a long time." He was looking at their hands, not at her, which was the tell that this was harder to say. "Not because I was broken. I want to be clear that I understand I wasn't broken. But something in me had closed, like a room that gets locked when it's not in use and eventually you stop having the key." "But do you have to key?" He paused. "I don't feel locked like that anymore." She didn't say anything immediately. She let it sit. "When did it change?" she asked. He looked up at her. "When you walked across that dance floor in shoes that didn't fit and asked a stranger to help you survive an evening." He almost smiled. "It was a very human thing to do." "Most people would call it desperate," she said. "Most people are wrong," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. This man who said the things he meant and left keys on hooks by doors and stood outside cars instead of waiting inside them. And was terrible at being careful, and made pasta from a nanny's written instructions, and was going to walk into a company all hands on Thursday and say something true in a room full of people who'd prefer the strategic version. "I'm falling in love with you," she said. She said it the way he said things, just reported the fact, without dress. It was out before she'd made the decision to say it, but once it was out, she found she wasn't afraid of it. She'd been carrying it for a while. It was heavier inside than it turned out to be outside. He looked at her. "I know," he said, quietly. "I know, because I feel the same way, and I recognize it." "You could say it back," she said. "I will," he said, "when I can say it properly." He held her gaze. "I don't want to say it for the first time in response to a crisis." She understood that. She understood it exactly. "Okay," she said. "I need it to mean the thing it means," he said. "Not comfort, not reaction, the actual thing." She nodded. They sat together on the couch, and the city went dark outside the windows, and at some point Emily's head was on his shoulder, and he was talking quietly about an engineering problem in the new model's chassis that he found genuinely interesting, and she was asking questions she mostly followed and some she didn't. And it was that specific intimacy of two people talking about something one of them cared about, while the other one paid attention not because of the subject, but because of the person. She fell asleep on his couch around 10:30. She didn't mean to. She was aware of it the way you were aware of the edge of sleep, one moment present and then not. When she woke, it was past midnight and there was a blanket over her that hadn't been there before, and the apartment was quiet, and the hall light was on down the corridor. She lay still for a moment, oriented to the room, the lake through the dark windows, the horse drawings on the coffee table, the sound of the building settling the way old buildings did in winter. She thought about Thursday's all-hands meeting. She thought about 400 people in a room and Ethan Calloway standing in front of them with no strategy and no spokesperson and no version of the truth that had been sanded down for public consumption. She thought about what it cost a person to keep choosing the true thing when the strategic thing was right there, available, obviously easier. She'd been doing it herself for years, in her work, in her relationships, in the way she showed up to a gala in borrowed shoes rather than staying home and pretending she was fine. She knew what it cost. She knew the specific arithmetic of it. She got up and folded the blanket and left it on the couch. She found her coat and her bag. She stood at the kitchen island and wrote on a notepad she found by the refrigerator. "Thank you for dinner. Don't fire anyone else on my behalf. The pasta was good. E." She put it on the counter where he'd find it in the morning. She looked at the purple horse on the refrigerator. It was still there, still confident, still drawn without apology, exactly as Sophie had decided it should be. She thought, I used to be brave like that. Before I learned that other people were looking. She was going to try to be that again. Thursday came with the specific gray certainty of a Chicago winter day that had decided to be exactly what it was. No drama, just cold and flat-lit and present. Emily opened Cafe Vero at 5, made drinks until noon, and then went home and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open and worked on a brand identity proposal for one of the 2 clients she'd landed from Ethan's kitchen table on a Sunday morning. She did not watch the clock. She watched it anyway. The Callaway Automotive all-hands meeting was at 2 o'clock, which she knew because Jenkins had forwarded the calendar event to Ethan's personal account, and Ethan had mentioned it in passing, and she'd noticed the time with the deliberate casualness of someone trying not to notice things deliberately. At 2:47, her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. "It's Jenkins. Mr. Calloway said I should let you know the meeting went well. He also said to tell you he said the thing. He'll explain later." Jay, she read that message 3 times. He said the thing. She put her phone down on the table and looked at her laptop, at the half-finished brand identity work, at the client's name at the top of the document, at the specific geometry of the logo she was building from the inside out, finding the real shape of something beneath the version it thought it was. Her phone buzzed again. Ethan this time. "Are you home?" "Yes," she typed. "Can I come over?" She looked around her apartment. The yellow lamp, the water stain, the rubber-banded bills on the bookshelf. The kitchen table she'd been working at, with 2 empty coffee cups and a notepad of sketches and the functional, unglamorous material of her actual life. "Yes," she typed. "I'll make coffee." He arrived 40 minutes later in a car she heard from the street, which meant he'd come directly from the office. He was still in his work clothes, tie still on, which meant he hadn't stopped home. He looked like the end of a significant day, not undone, but the kind of tired that was partly physical and partly the weight of having said something large in a room full of people. She handed him a coffee at the door. He took it and looked at her apartment with the same quality he brought to everything. Actual attention, not the polished discomfort of a man assessing an unfamiliar space. "Come in," she said. He came in. He sat at her kitchen table, which was the right size for two people and not a person more, and she sat across from him, and the yellow lamp was doing its yellow thing in the corner. "Tell me what happened," she said. He told her. He'd walked into the all-hands with 400 employees and the senior board members seated at the front and Jenkins to his left, and a prepared statement on the podium that he'd written at 11 p.m. the night before. He'd covered the business first, the Q1 projections, the contractor dispute and its resolution, the new model timeline, the Pacific contract which had closed 2 days earlier and which Jenkins had, in fact, handled beautifully. He'd gone through all of it with the flat, decisive vocabulary of someone who knew the material from the floor up, and then he'd set the prepared notes aside. "I didn't use them," he said. "What did you say instead?" He turned his coffee mug in his hands. "I told them that there's been coverage this week about my personal life and that I wanted to address it directly rather than let it sit in the room like something no one was supposed to mention." He paused. "I told them that the woman in the photographs is someone I've been seeing for 6 weeks, and that she is not a liability, and that she is not a situation, and that she is not something I need to manage or explain or apologize for, and that anyone in this company who treats the coverage as something to be leveraged, internally or externally, would be finding that out from me directly." "Asuo, mots, ma." Emily was quiet. "The board chair looked like he'd swallowed something sideways," Ethan said. About 40 seconds of complete silence. "And then?" "And then one of the senior engineers, Pete Nakamura, been with me since year 3, started clapping." He said it with the slight, undisguised surprise of someone who'd expected something different. "And then about half the room joined in, which I did not anticipate." She looked at him across the small table in her small kitchen with the water stain on the ceiling and the lamp throwing yellow light over everything. "Half the room." "More or less." "What did the board say after?" "The chair pulled me aside." He set the mug down. He said he appreciated the transparency, but that the framing was, and I'm quoting, "aggressively informal for an investor-facing context." "What did you tell him?" Ethan looked at her with the expression she'd come to understand was what he looked like when he found something mildly, genuinely absurd. "I told him I'd think about it." "Ethan." "I told him I disagreed with his framing and that I'd let him know if my position changed." He paused. "He's a competent board chair, and I respect him, and I'm not going to change my position." She looked at him. At this man sitting in her apartment under a yellow lamp, in his Thursday work clothes, who had walked into a room of 400 people and said the true thing, without a strategy or a spokesperson or a version that had been sanded down for public consumption, and who had apparently not anticipated being applauded for it. "You didn't think they'd clap," she said. "No," he said honestly. "What did you think would happen?" He considered it. "I thought it would be received, professionally, and then we'd move on and everyone would think what they thought privately, and the board would request a follow-up conversation, and I'd have it and say the same thing again." He paused. "I did not think Pete Nakamura would start clapping." She felt her eyes get hot again, which was happening with increasing frequency, and she was increasingly making peace with. "Ethan." "What?" "You keep doing things that—" She stopped, tried again. "You keep being exactly what you say you are. Do you understand how unusual that is?" He looked at her. "I think you've met a lot of people who weren't." "I think that's probably true," she said. He reached across the small table. She took his hand the way she'd started doing, without preamble, without ceremony, because it had become the natural geography between them. "The coverage will continue," he said. "I want you to know I understand that. I'm not naive about it. There will be more pieces and more photos, and the board is going to have opinions for a while." "I know," she said. "It's going to be uncomfortable." "I'm familiar with uncomfortable," she said. He looked at her. "I know you are." They sat in her kitchen with the city outside and the yellow lamp and the comfortable, imperfect silence of two people who had both said significant things in the past few weeks and were living in the reality of having said them. "Can I show you something?" Emily said. She got up and went to her bookshelf, the one with the rubber-banded bills, which she noted he had not commented on or looked at with any readable expression. And she pulled down a flat portfolio case she'd had since art school, slightly battered at the corners. She put it on the table and opened it. Inside were the designs she'd been proudest of. Not client work, her own, the sketches and studies and identity systems she'd built in her own time. The ones that had never had a client because no one had hired her to make them. She'd made them because she needed to. They were good. She knew they were good the way you knew things you'd made alone, without the social machinery of other people telling you. They were good because they were true, because she'd built them to be exactly the thing they were, and nothing else. She watched Ethan go through them. He didn't rush. He went page by page the way he listened, with actual attention, not performance of it. He stopped on 3 of them for longer and looked at them the way she'd looked at Sophie's horse drawing, with the specific quality of recognizing something. "This one," he said, stopping on a brand identity she'd built for an imaginary architecture firm, clean, structured, with a word mark that resolved into the shape of a building's cross-section if you looked at it long enough. This is what you were describing, the gap between what something is and what it thinks it is. "I built it to practice," she said. "There was no client. I just wanted to see if I could do the full system." "You can," he said. "I know." She said it without apology, which she was relearning. "I know I can. I just need the room to do it." He looked at her across the portfolio. "I want to talk to you about something," he said, "and I want you to hear it as a question and not as an offer, and I want you to say no if no is what you think." She held his gaze. "Okay." Callaway Automotive is rebranding 3 of its sublabels in the next 18 months. The visual identity work is going out to 3 firms for competitive proposal. He paused. "I want you in that process, not as not because of who you are to me, because of this." He touched the edge of the portfolio. "You would compete for it exactly as anyone else would. Jenkins runs the process. I recuse myself from the selection committee." She looked at him. "You'd recuse yourself." "It has to be clean," he said, "or it means nothing." Ethan, that's a large contract." "Yes," he said. "It is. I'm one person. You can bring in collaborators, structure it as a studio if you want. I'll have Jenkins send you the brief." He paused. "Say no if it's too complicated. I mean that." She looked at the portfolio, at the architecture firm identity, at the 3 he'd stopped on, at the full system she'd built alone in her apartment because she'd needed to know she could. She thought about Marcus and the studio closing and the specific grief of watching something real get canceled because the infrastructure wasn't there. She thought about 2 clients from a Sunday morning at Ethan's kitchen table and Jess's dry cleaning tab and the 4 half-formed plans she rotated between. She thought about Sophie drawing a purple horse without apology because the horse was purple because she'd decided it was. "Send me the brief," she said. He nodded. Something in his expression settled, the same settling she'd seen in the kitchen when she'd told him she was falling for him, like a thing finding its level. "I want to be clear," she said. "If I don't win it, we don't talk about it." "Agreed. And if I do win it, it's because the work was right." "That's the only way I'd want it," he said. She looked at him across the portfolio, across the kitchen table, across the particular distance that had been closing between them for 6 weeks in borrowed shoes and raisin opinions and hall lights left on for bad dreams. She thought, this is what it looks like when something is real. Not the gala version, not the magazine cover, not the comment sections with their gold digger narratives and their fairy tale narratives and all the other versions of this story that had nothing to do with the actual story. This, a kitchen table and a portfolio case, and a man drinking coffee and meaning what he said. She closed the portfolio. "Thank you for coming over," she said. "Thank you for the coffee," he said. "You make it correctly." "Obviously," she said, and he laughed. A real one, low and unguarded. And the yellow lamp did its yellow thing, and outside the city was being Chicago in December, cold and certain and entirely indifferent to them. And inside that kitchen, it didn't matter at all. The brief arrived on a Monday, 2 days after Ethan had sat at her kitchen table and laughed in the yellow lamplight. Jenkins sent it, professionally, through an official Callaway Automotive vendor inquiry email, addressed to Emily Carter Design, which was not yet a registered business name but would be by the end of that week, because Emily Carter had spent the Sunday between those two events at the Cook County Clerk's office with a $40 filing fee and the specific energy of someone who had decided to stop rotating between 4 half-formed plans and commit to one. The brief was 42 pages. She printed it at the library 2 blocks from her apartment because her home printer had been broken for 8 months, and she carried it home in a folder and sat at her kitchen table and read all of it twice before she made dinner. It was a real brief. That was the first thing she confirmed, reading it with the professional eyes she'd spent years developing. The language was specific, the deliverables were defined, the timeline was aggressive but not impossible. The budget range was in the document and it was significant. Jenkins had not softened it. There were no invisible provisions for her benefit. It was exactly what Ethan had said it would be, a competitive process, clean, and she would have to earn it. She almost put it in the folder and went to make pasta. She almost told herself she wasn't ready, that one person wasn't a studio, that the timing was wrong, that the risk of losing was too high and the risk of winning was something she hadn't fully thought through yet. She recognized that voice. She'd been listening to it for 3 years. She made herself a coffee, correctly, and she sat back down and opened the brief to page 1 and started making notes in the margins. She worked until midnight. She called Marcus at 11, her mentor, the one who'd closed the studio and gone freelance, the one she'd mourned like a canceled thing. And she said, "I have something I need to talk through with you." And he said, "Emily, it's 11 o'clock. And she said, "I know. I'm sorry. It can wait." And he said, "It clearly can't. What is it?" And she told him. All of it, including Ethan, because Marcus had known her long enough that leaving that part out would be a different kind of dishonesty. Marcus was quiet for a moment after she finished. "Is the brief legitimate?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I've read it twice. It's real." "Are you being set up to win?" "I don't think so." He recused himself from the selection committee. "Who's on the committee?" "Jenkins runs it, 2 external creative consultants and the head of product development." Another pause. "How are you structured? What are you putting in front of them?" "That's what I need to think through. I'm registered as a sole proprietorship as of Sunday. I could bring in contractors for the execution, maybe 2, people I know can do the work." "3, Marcus said. "You need 3, including me." She stopped. "Marcus, you need a strategist and 2 execution-level people minimum for a brief this size. I'm the strategist. You run design. We get someone for production and someone for motion if it requires it." His voice had the quality she remembered from the studio, not the exhausted end-stage quality, but the earlier one, the version of him that had been building something. "I've been waiting for a reason to work on something real. This is a reason." "This is not a guaranteed win," she said. "Every worthwhile thing is not a guaranteed win," he said. "Send me the brief tonight." She did. She didn't tell Ethan any of this. That was important to her, that the process be entirely separate, that what happened in the competition happened without his knowledge or input. She told him only that she was working on the proposal and that she'd let him know when it was submitted. He accepted that with the same quality he accepted most things she drew a boundary around, not without noticing, but without making it complicated. They kept seeing each other through January. The coverage had quieted to a low simmer. There were still occasional pieces, still the occasional comment section, but the news cycle had moved on in the way it always did, and the story of a billionaire and a waitress had been replaced in the public appetite by newer and louder things. Emily had stopped reading the comment sections, which her mother had told her to do, and which turned out to be the right call, which she did not tell her mother because some victories were sweeter when they stayed internal. The board chair, whose name was Gerald Fenn, requested a breakfast meeting with Ethan in mid-January. Ethan told Emily about it afterward, sitting in her kitchen as he'd gotten into the habit of doing, his tie loosened, his coffee correct. "How did it go?" she asked. "He told me he understood my position, but wanted to express the board's concern about the optics of the relationship given the upcoming investor meetings in March." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I appreciated the board's concern and that I'd take it under advisement." He paused. "Then I told him I'd been thinking about the Q1 investor presentation, and I thought we should lead with the Pacific contract closure and the new model's timeline, because the numbers there were strong enough to recenter the conversation before it got to anything else." Emily looked at him. "You gave him a better problem to care about." "I gave him something real to focus on," he said. "Gerald is a smart man. He cares about the company. If I give him a concrete thing to care about, he'll care about that. The other thing, he was going to care about it as long as it seemed like the main thing. Is that strategy or is that just truth? He considered it. Both, maybe, he said. I'm not sure they're always different. She thought about her design work, finding the real shape beneath the presented one, making the visual language match the true thing. She thought about the brief in the folder on her shelf, and Marcus on the phone at 11 o'clock, and the registered business name on a piece of paper in her filing drawer. She thought about how the best strategy she'd ever found was just being exactly what she was, and letting that be enough. I think they're usually different, she said, but when they're not, it's the most powerful thing there is. He looked at her in the way he'd been looking at her more lately, with a quality she didn't have the exact language for, though she was getting closer to it. Like he was still learning the geography of her and finding it consistently more than he'd expected. In the first week of February, Emily, Marcus, and 2 collaborators, a production designer named Yuki, whom Emily had worked with at the old studio, and a motion designer named Derek, who Marcus had brought in from a project 2 years back, submitted the Callaway Automotive proposal. It was 96 pages. Emily had slept 4 hours on the Sunday before the Monday deadline, which was the cost of doing something real, and she paid it without complaint. And she sent it through the vendor portal at 7:53 a.m., and then went and opened Cafe Vero at 8 o'clock because she still had a shift and the work did not wait. The 7:15 regular came in. She set his drink on the counter before he reached her. He looked at it and then at her. "You look like you've been up all night," he said, which was the most he'd ever said to her. "I have," she said. He picked up his drink. "Worth it?" She thought about the 96 pages, the brand system she'd built from the inside out, the logo that resolved into something true if you looked long enough, the identity that matched the real thing and not the fantasy. "Ask me in 3 weeks," she said. He nodded and left, and she wiped the counter and made the next drink and kept moving. She told Ethan the proposal was in. He texted back, "I know, Jenkins confirmed receipt. I won't hear anything about it until the committee decides." A pause, then, "I'm proud of you. That's separate from the rest of it." She read that twice. She typed back, "Thank you." Then, "That means something." His response, "I know it does. That's why I said it." 3 weeks was actually 3 weeks and 2 days, which was how long it took the selection committee to review all 4 competing proposals and reach a decision. Emily knew there were 4 because that information was in the brief. She did not know who the other 3 firms were. She did not ask. Marcus asked because Marcus had been in the industry long enough to have contacts everywhere, and he came back with the information that 2 of the other 3 firms were established Chicago studios with significant portfolios, and one was a New York shop with international clients. And Emily listened to that and then said, "Okay," and went back to working on a separate branding project for one of her 2 existing clients, because the waiting was the part she had the least control over, and she'd learned the hard way that filling uncontrollable spaces with anxiety was a reliable way to make the anxiety worse, but no improvement on the outcome. Jenkins called on a Wednesday morning at 9:41, while Emily was on her break at Cafe Vero. "Ms. Carter," he said, "this is David Jenkins from Callaway Automotive. I'm calling on behalf of the Creative Selection Committee." She stepped outside into the February cold, the kind that was beyond temperature into something almost physical. "Yes," she said. "The committee has completed its review of all submitted proposals," he said. He had a good phone voice, formal but not cold, the voice of someone who understood that what he said mattered to the person on the other end. It was a competitive field. The committee felt strongly about 2 of the proposals in particular. She said nothing. She watched the street. "Ms. Carter, the committee has selected your proposal. Emily Carter Design will be awarded the Callaway sub-label rebranding contract pending contract execution." He paused. "Congratulations." She held the phone against her ear in the February cold outside the coffee shop where she'd been making other people's drinks since before dawn. In the city she'd arrived in at 24 with $400 and a fierce, slightly delusional certainty, and she felt something move through her that she didn't immediately have a name for. Not euphoria. That wasn't the right word. Something quieter and heavier and more real than euphoria. The sensation of a thing clicking into place that had been slightly off its axis for a long time. "Thank you," she said. Please tell the committee. Thank you. I will, Jenkins said. My office will send the contract documents today. Welcome to the project. She hung up and stood on the sidewalk for another minute. Then she called Marcus. He answered on the second ring and she said, "We got it." And he said nothing for 3 full seconds, and then he said, "Emily," in the voice she remembered from the studio when something had gone exactly right. The voice that was 2 parts professional satisfaction and 1 part something more personal that he'd never quite admitted to. "We got it," she said again, because it felt like it needed to be said twice. "Yes, we did," he said. "Yes, we absolutely did." She went back inside and finished her shift. She made drinks and ran the register and cleaned the steam wand and did all the small, specific tasks that made up the hours between 9:41 and 3 o'clock, and she held the news in her chest like something warm she wasn't ready to put down yet. She didn't call Ethan. She waited until she was home, until she'd showered and changed and made herself dinner. Real dinner, not just pasta. She'd bought groceries on the way home with the specific intention of celebrating quietly and privately before the rest of it began. And she sat at her kitchen table and she called him. "Hi," he said. "I got the contract," she said. A silence, long enough that she knew he was feeling something and taking a moment with it. "The committee decided," he said. "Jenkins called this morning." "Emily." His voice had something in it she'd heard before and kept finding she wasn't tired of. "That's yours. You understand that? That's entirely yours." "I know," she said. "That's why I waited to tell you. Because you needed it to be real first." "Yes," she said, "because I needed to feel it as mine before I said it out loud to you." He understood that. She knew he'd understand it, which was one of the things she knew about him now. The long list of specific things that she'd accumulated over 4 months of being with a person who was genuinely trying to be honest about who he was. "Can I take you to dinner?" he said. "Somewhere that's not a gala." "Mirandy's?" she said. "Unless you'd like somewhere different." "No," she said. "Mirandy's is right. It's where we had our first real dinner. It should be where we celebrate the first real thing." He was quiet for a moment. "You think of that as the first real dinner, don't you?" "Yes," he said. "I just didn't know you did." They went to Mirandy's on Saturday, and the owner came to the table again and shook Ethan's hand, and this time he shook Emily's too, which she suspected was because Ethan had said something when he made the reservation, but she decided not to interrogate it. She ordered the duck again. He ordered the lamb again. They shared the potatoes, and this time let them cool enough before trying them. The dinner was different from the first one, not better, exactly. The first one had been extraordinary in the specific way that first things were, with all the electricity of not knowing yet where anything was going. This one was quieter and more comfortable and more frightening in a way she couldn't have explained but felt clearly. The fear that came not from uncertainty, but from having something real enough to lose. "I want to ask you something," she said, over the second glass of wine. "Ask," he said. "That first night. At the gala. When I walked over to you and asked you to dance." She held her wine glass, not drinking. "What were you actually thinking, in that moment, before you said yes?" He considered it with the seriousness he gave things that deserved it. "I was thinking that you were the first person all evening who'd spoken to me like I was a person, rather than a situation to navigate," he said. "And that whatever your reason for asking, it was honest. You weren't performing anything. You were just standing there needing something real." He paused, and I thought, I know what that feels like. She looked at him. "That's what made you say yes." "That," and he almost smiled. "The shoes." She stared at him. "The shoes. They didn't fit right. You were standing slightly wrong because of it. Not obviously. Just enough that I noticed." He met her eyes. "You'd come to that party in shoes that hurt you, and you were going to stand in them all night because that's what the situation required. And I thought, that's someone who shows up." She felt the thing in her chest that had been building since November, the thing she'd been calling by various careful names to keep it from getting too large to manage. She felt it clearly and without apology, and she let it be what it was. "Ethan," she said. "Yes." "I love you," she said. "I told you I was falling. I'm not falling anymore. I'm there." He looked at her across the Mirandy's table, in the low, honest light, with the lamb half finished, and the potatoes going cold. and the city outside doing its indifferent city thing. "I know," he said. "I've been waiting to say it properly." "Say it now," she said. "This is proper enough." He held her gaze. "I love you," he said. "I have since the night you asked me not to perform anything, and then sat in my kitchen until midnight talking about your brother and your design work and the couple who held hands at your restaurant." He paused. "I love you, and I'm not going to be careful about saying it." She laughed, and the laugh had water in the corners of it that she didn't try to stop. "You're never careful about anything." "I tried to be," he said. "It didn't take." She reached across the table and he met her halfway, their hands on the white linen between the plates. And neither of them said anything for a moment because there wasn't anything that needed saying. The thing about love, Emily had learned, not from fairy tales, not from the version she'd absorbed growing up and then systematically had dismantled by experience. The thing about love was that it was not rescue. It didn't arrive and fix the broken infrastructure or pay the overdue bills or make the two jobs feel like one or restore the thing that closed when it should have stayed open. It didn't do any of that, and anyone who told you otherwise was selling a version designed to make you feel better about something that was actually hard. What this did, was something less dramatic and more durable. It made the hard things slightly less isolating. It made the room feel different when someone was in it who understood the gap between what you presented and what you actually were, and chose the actual thing anyway. It made Sunday mornings at a kitchen table with a coffee someone else made correctly feel like, not an answer, but the right question. She thought about that on the walk back to his car after dinner, his hand in hers on the February sidewalk, the lake wind doing its reliable thing. She thought about the borrowed dress and the 11 days the invitation sat on her counter, and Daniel telling her she hadn't moved forward enough, and the specific arithmetic of showing up to something you were afraid of and finding out the fear was pointing at the wrong thing. She'd been afraid of being seen as insufficient. She'd come to that gala braced for the verdict she'd been building in her own head for years. That the life she had was evidence of something lacking in her. That the two jobs and the bills and the studio that closed were a story about her limitations rather than just the circumstances of a particular chapter. What Ethan had seen, standing alone at the edge of that dance floor, was someone who showed up in shoes that hurt because the situation required it. That was a different verdict entirely. And the thing about being seen accurately, not generously, not through a romantic filter that softened the edges, but accurately with the actual facts, was that it changed something, not in the circumstances. The bills were still rubber-banded on the bookshelf. The water stain was still on the ceiling. But she'd stopped looking at those things as verdicts. Spring came to Chicago the way it always did. Reluctantly, in stages, the lake refusing to warm up even after the air had committed to it. March arrived, and the investor meetings Ethan had redirected Gerald Fenn's attention toward happened and went well by every measurable standard, which Emily knew because Jenkins sent a brief note to the project channel they'd set up for the rebranding work that said, Q1 meetings concluded successfully, full team ahead, and because Ethan came to dinner that night looking like a man who had put down something heavy, the rebranding work was consuming and real. Emily had structured it the way she'd wanted for years. Marcus as strategic lead, Yuki on production, Derek on motion, herself running design and creative direction, and the client relationship, which in this case meant regular meetings with the head of product development, a precise and quietly funny woman named Adieze who had strong opinions about the company's visual identity and was not shy about expressing them. "She reminds me of someone," Ethan said, when Emily described the third meeting. "Who?" He looked at her. "Stop it," she said, but she was smiling. The work was good. She knew it the way she'd known the portfolio pieces she'd shown him in her apartment, from the inside without needing external confirmation, though the external confirmation came too, in the form of Adieze's feedback in the second month. "The committee has reviewed the preliminary identity system, and we're genuinely excited. This feels like us." That phrase, "this feels like us," was the thing Emily kept. That was the job done right. Not impressive, not clever, not award eligible, just us. The real shape of the thing. She framed it in the way she framed things that mattered, not literally, but in the part of her memory where she kept the things she wanted to stay certain of. April. The lake finally warmed enough that walking along it didn't require full winter gear, just the medium coat, the one at the back of the closet. Emily and Ethan had a rhythm now that had moved beyond the tentative architecture of early months into something with actual structure. Dinners, weekends, the specific geography of two lives that had adjusted to each other without either of them being subsumed. She kept her apartment. That was important. She'd thought about it and decided it wasn't about cost or practicality. It was about the thing her apartment represented, the proof that she'd built something herself, even when it was imperfect and had water stains and yellow lamplight and too small space. It was hers, and she'd maintained it alone, and that fact was something she needed to keep having access to. Ethan understood this without her having to explain all of it. She gave him the outline, and he filled in the rest the way he filled in most things, with attention, without making it his problem to solve. What she did was spend more time at his place. There was a rhythm to that, too. She'd arrive and Sophie would materialize from somewhere and show her whatever current thing was consuming her creative life. The horse phase had given way to a deep sea phase, and then briefly to a volcano phase, and by April had settled into a complicated hybrid that Sophie called horse scientists, which were horses who were also scientists, and Emily engaged with this with the complete seriousness it deserved. A horse scientist would specialize in oceanography, Emily said one Saturday morning, sitting on the kitchen floor with Sophie and a large piece of paper they were drawing on together. Sophie considered this. Or chemistry, she said. What kind of chemistry? The kind that makes things glow. Sophie drew a horse in a lab coat with tremendous speed and confidence. Do you know how to make things glow? I know how to make logos glow, Emily said. It's a different skill, but it has some overlap. Sophie appeared to find this acceptable. She drew a flask next to the horse. Ethan was at the kitchen table on his laptop, doing the thing where he worked and monitored the conversation simultaneously, the parental superpower of parallel processing. He caught Emily's eye when she glanced over and looked away quickly, in the way she'd come to understand meant he was managing an expression he didn't want her to see him having. She turned back to Sophie and drew a microscope. The lake house came later. In May, when the weather had finally made a firm commitment to being spring, Ethan mentioned he had a property an hour north of the city on the lake. Not the penthouse lake view, but actual lake, actual shore. The kind of house that had been in his family since before the company, and that he'd been to maybe 3 times since Rachel died because it had felt like a place that required more than him alone. Come up for a weekend, he said. Bring nothing that needs to be done. She laughed at that. Everything needs to be done. Bring it anyway, he said. Just don't open it. She brought her laptop, which she didn't open. She brought the medium coat she didn't need because May at a lake house turned out to be warmer than May in the city. She brought the quiet she'd been getting better at, allowing herself. The house was smaller than she'd expected from a man with a penthouse. A real house. With a porch that needed paint in one corner and rooms that smelled like the particular combination of wood and lake air and time that certain old houses had. It had bookshelves with actual books that had been read, not arranged for display, and a kitchen that was smaller than the penthouses and somehow more comfortable. And through the back windows, the lake was different from 14 floors up. Closer, more present, moving in a way that was visible rather than implied. Sophie had been to the house before. She went through it with the confident familiarity of someone returning to a known territory, pointing out things that mattered to her. The window with the best bird view, the loose board on the back porch she'd been telling her dad to fix for a year, the tree she'd climbed that one time that had been a whole thing. You're not supposed to climb it? Emily asked. I'm supposed to tell him before I climb it, Sophie said, which I did, after. Emily looked at her. That's creative compliance. Sophie appeared to find this a useful phrase. Yes, she said. Creative compliance. She filed it. That first evening at the house, Ethan made dinner. Real dinner, not Clara's instructions, just the things he knew how to make, which turned out to be a limited but reliable list. And they ate on the porch with the lake making its consistent sound, and the May light going long and golden over the water. Sophie ate and talked and went inside to read at 7:30 with the independence of a child who'd learned early to give adults the space they didn't know how to ask for. After Sophie was in bed, Emily and Ethan sat on the porch in the May dark. The string lights he'd put up along the railing cast everything in a low amber that reminded her faintly of her yellow lamp at home. The lake was very close. You could hear it breathing. She thought about the question she'd been sitting with for weeks. She thought about the specific architecture of what they'd built over 6 months. Not the love, which was its own category, and she was certain of it, but the structure around it. The two lives that had learned to hold each other without one collapsing into the other. The way she'd kept her apartment and her business name and her Sunday mornings and her independence, and the way he'd kept his careful directness and his inability to perform things he didn't feel, and his keys on the hook by the door, and the way those things hadn't become obstacles between them, but instead were the actual material of what they were. She thought about what she wanted next, not what was safe, not what was strategic, the actual want, the one she'd been learning to stop being ashamed of. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He was sitting beside her with his drink, looking at the lake. "Yes." "What does this look like?" she said. "To you, going forward, what is it? What are you hoping it looks like?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the considering an answer quiet, but the deeper one. The one she'd learned was him locating something he already knew but needed to find the right surface for. "I want you here," he said. "Not just the lake house. I mean," he paused, "I want you in the daily version of things. I want Sophie to know you're a constant, not a variable. I want you to work on the things you're supposed to be working on, and I want to be the person in the kitchen while you do it." He turned to look at her. "I know that's complicated. I know your apartment is yours and the independence of it matters, and I'm not trying to collapse that." "But," she said, "but I'm tired of it being provisional," he said. "I'm tired of the version where we haven't decided yet." She looked at him, at the lake, at the string lights casting amber over the porch where they were sitting, the porch that needed paint in one corner, the house that smelled like wood and time. "I'm not tired of deciding things," she said slowly. "I think the deciding is part of what I need it to be. Not one big decision that covers everything, but the ongoing version, where we keep choosing it." He held her gaze. "I can do that," he said. "I know you can," she said. "You've been doing it since the gala. Every time it would have been easier to let it be ambiguous, you said the thing. I told you I was bad at being careful." "You're very bad at it," she agreed. "It's one of my favorite things about you." He set down his drink and reached over and pulled her toward him. Not dramatically, just the quiet claiming gesture of someone who'd made a decision and was acting on it. And she went, because this was the thing she'd arrived at over 6 months of being seen accurately. She was allowed to go toward the things she wanted without bracing for the cost of wanting them. They sat together in the amber light on the porch that needed paint, above the lake that was still making its consistent sound, and the night settled around them the way nights did at lake house properties in May, with all the unhurried patience of something that had been there long before them and would be there long after. "Tell me what you're afraid of," he said quietly. Not a demand, an invitation. She thought about it honestly. "I'm afraid of being the person who wanted something badly enough to talk herself into it," she said. "I've done that before. I wanted the relationship with Daniel to work, and I kept reinterpreting things until the reinterpreting became the relationship." She paused. "I don't do that with you. I've checked. Every version of what we are, I can account for without adjusting the facts to make it better than it is. It's just..." She stopped. "Just what?" he said. "It's just actually good," she said. "And that's the scariest version. Because the thing I spent years believing under everything was that good things required some kind of cost I wasn't paying, some fine print." He was quiet for a moment. "There is fine print," he said. "I have a complicated life. A company with 12,000 employees and a board that has opinions. A daughter who has strong feelings about marine biology and will grow up and probably terrify everyone she meets in the best possible way. I'm a person who was locked up for years and is still learning to leave the doors open." He held her gaze. "The fine print is real. I just don't think it's what you were afraid it was." "No," she said. "It's not." "What was it?" "I was afraid it was me," she said. "The fine print being me. The waitress with the bills and the too small shoes. I was afraid that the real version of your life would eventually make room for someone more appropriate." He looked at her with an expression that had no social gloss on it whatsoever, no management, just the thing underneath. "There is no more appropriate," he said. "You are the appropriate. You're the person who shows up in shoes that hurt because the situation requires it, and then asks a stranger to help her survive the evening, and then sits in his kitchen until midnight talking about raisins and her brother and the couple who holds hands at a restaurant." He paused. The woman who submits a 96-page proposal because she decided the work deserved it, not because she knew the outcome. The woman who kept her apartment because it was hers. He shook his head slightly. There's no version of my life that needs someone different from you. You're what the situation is. She sat with that. She looked at the lake. She thought about the 11 days the invitation had sat on her kitchen counter, and Jess's dry-cleaned black dress, and the shoes that were half a size too small, and walking across a dance floor toward a stranger because not going felt like letting fear win. She thought about Sophie's purple horse, drawn without apology, exactly as Sophie had decided it should be. She thought about keys on a hook by the door, and a hall light left on for bad dreams, and a man who stood outside a car instead of waiting inside it because he wanted to see her walk out. She thought about Marcus on the phone at 11 o'clock saying yes, we absolutely did, and the contract document on her kitchen table, and a Dieze's email that said, this feels like us, and the specific satisfaction of finding the real shape of something beneath the version it thought it was. She thought about all the versions of herself she'd brought to this. The one in the borrowed dress, the one at the kitchen table with the low mane, the one at Mirandi's ordering the duck without apologizing for wanting it, the one who'd stood on a sidewalk in November after a first kiss and called her best friend and said, I think I have to find out. She'd found out. The finding out had been imperfect and frightening and occasionally humiliating and frequently more work than she'd anticipated, and the best thing she'd done since arriving in Chicago at 24 with $400 and a certainty she'd spent years trying to hold on to. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. I'm not afraid of the fine print, she said. I'm in. He didn't say anything. He took her hand, not tentatively, not as a question, with the full intention of someone who'd decided, and they sat together above the lake in the May dark while the string lights did their amber thing, and somewhere inside the house, Sophie was asleep with whatever light she'd needed, and the night was quiet in the specific way of places far enough from cities to remember what quiet actually was. There were still things unresolved. There would always be things unresolved, because that was the actual nature of things, and anyone telling you otherwise was omitting a chapter. The board would have opinions about the March numbers, and Jenkins would continue to manage the things Ethan delegated, and the comment sections would periodically re-engage, and Emily's 2 jobs would narrow to 1, and then to her own work as the Callaway contract moved forward. And Marcus threatened to move back to full-time collaborating, and she hadn't told him yes yet, but she would. Ryan would text her at 11 p.m., with things their mother couldn't know, and she'd make the decision in the dark the way she always did. Sophie would climb trees and tell Ethan after and use the phrase creative compliance until it made its way permanently into her vocabulary, which Emily knew because Sophie had already used it twice. The keys would stay on the hook by the door. Emily had looked at them one evening when Ethan wasn't watching, those ordinary keys on an ordinary hook in a hallway that led to a life in which she was becoming a constant rather than a variable. And she'd thought about Rachel, not with sadness exactly, but with a kind of recognition. The woman who'd sat next to a man at dinner and known to bring tea. The woman with the private smile and the certain hand on his arm. The woman who'd made the quiet things possible and who wasn't here anymore, who would never be here anymore, and whose absence had shaped the man Emily loved into something that had taught itself to leave the doors open again. She'd looked at those keys and thought, I will not pretend you didn't happen. I will not take up space by diminishing the space you left. That wasn't something you said out loud. It was something you carried and honored by how you showed up, by being true to the person he'd learned to need, which meant being true to herself, which was the same thing, which was what she'd been trying to get back to since before the borrowed dress and the gala and all of it. The night at the lake house didn't end in a declaration or a proposal or any of the formal architecture of stories that were trying to announce their own significance. It ended the way the best things ended, simply, without drama, with the quiet satisfaction of 2 people who had told each other the true things and found them sufficient. The lake kept moving. The string lights stayed on until they went inside. Emily Carter, who had come to a charity gala 6 months ago in shoes that hurt to prove something to a man who wasn't worth proving anything to, fell asleep in a house that smelled like wood and lake air and time, with the sound of the water close enough to hear. And she woke up in the morning to Sophie standing in the doorway, asking if she knew anything about volcanic oceanography, which was apparently a new subspecialty in horse science. And Emily said she thought she could learn, And Sophie said, "Good," and left. And the Maylight came through the window onto the unfamiliar ceiling of a room that was becoming familiar, and downstairs Ethan was making coffee. Incorrectly, she could tell from the sound, the water running too long. And she smiled at the ceiling and didn't say anything about it yet. She would say something about it, but not yet. Some things you watched without interrupting. She'd learned that from him. She was learning it still. That was the thing about real love. Not the version that announced itself, not the version in the magazine profile, or the comment section, or the fairy tale shorthand that made it sound like a conclusion. Real love was ongoing, was daily, was two people in a kitchen with slightly wrong coffee and horse science questions, and the accumulated weight of everything they'd chosen not to perform, and everything they'd chosen to say instead. She got up. She went downstairs. She fixed the coffee.